What's up, guys? Welcome to Vision Harry. We've got something special today. What if Harry's accidental magic at age 5 destroyed blood wards and goblins discovered 40 years of Potter Vault theft? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The night the wards broke the cupboard under the stairs at number 4, Privet Drive smelled like dust and old shoes and the particular kind of damp that settles into wood when nothing living is supposed to be there for long. Harry Potter had lived in it for as long as he could remember. He was 5 years old, small even for that, with knees perpetually scraped and hair that grew back no matter how many times Aunt Petunia took the kitchen scissors to it. He didn't understand why it kept growing back. He didn't understand a lot of things: why Dudley got 3 birthday cakes and he got nothing, why the spiders in the cupboard seemed to arrange themselves into shapes when he was sad, why sometimes when he was very frightened the lights in the hallway flickered and went out all at once. He just knew that when those things happened, Uncle Vernon's face went the color of old beef and someone had to pay for it. Tonight, the paying was bad. It had started over breakfast. Dudley had knocked Harry's toast off the plate, deliberately, watching Harry's face the whole time, and Harry had made the mistake of reaching for it before it hit the floor. That was enough. Vernon had grabbed him by the collar and shaken him hard enough that Harry's teeth clicked together, and then he'd been sent to the cupboard without anything else to eat and told he'd stay there until he learned not to be greedy. That was 8 hours ago. The rain had started around noon and hadn't stopped. Harry could hear it hammering the kitchen window 2 rooms away, could hear the television in the lounge where Dudley was watching cartoons, could hear Petunia's sharp heels on the tile as she moved between the counter and the stove preparing a dinner that smelled like roast chicken and something with garlic that made Harry's stomach clench so hard it hurt. He pressed his forehead against the cupboard door. He was so hungry. Not the ordinary hungry that Dudley performed at mealtimes, the theatrical "I'm absolutely starving" that preceded 3 helpings and a pudding, but the real kind, the hollow kind, the kind that made it hard to think straight. His head throbbed. His hands felt strange, buzzing faintly at the fingertips the way they sometimes did when he'd been crying too long. He hadn't cried tonight, though. He'd stopped crying about the cupboard months ago. Crying made the buzzing worse, and the buzzing scared him more than the hunger. He didn't know what the buzzing was. He just knew it was his, the same way the spiders were his, the same way the lights were his. Something that lived in him that nobody had bothered to name. Outside the cupboard, Dudley laughed at something on the television. A bright, honking sound that he'd inherited directly from Vernon, fully formed. Harry closed his eyes. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. He was just feeling the hunger, the cold seeping through the thin cupboard walls, the particular loneliness of being 5 and locked in a small dark space while a family who didn't want you ate dinner 20 feet away. It wasn't dramatic. It was just what his life was. But tonight, for some reason, the feeling had a weight to it that it didn't usually have. Like pressure building in a closed room. Like something that had been compressed and compressed and compressed and was running out of space to compress into. The buzzing in his hands moved up his arms. Harry opened his eyes. The cupboard was still dark. The crack of light under the door still showed. But the air felt different, tighter, charged, like the moment before a thunderclap when the whole world holds its breath. The spiders in the corner had stopped moving. They were all facing him. "I just want to be out," Harry said, very quietly, to no one in particular. "I just want to be somewhere they're not." The buzzing reached his chest. And then it detonated. There was no sound, exactly, or rather, there was a sound, but it wasn't the kind ears were built for. It was felt in the sternum, in the back of the teeth, in the place behind the eyes where headaches lived. The cupboard door blew outward off its hinges and skidded 3 feet across the hallway floor. Every light in the house went out simultaneously. The television went silent. Somewhere upstairs, a mirror cracked from corner to corner. And outside, in the foundations of the house, beneath the garden path, beneath the neat little flower beds, woven into the very ley lines that ran under little whinging like invisible rivers, something old and precisely constructed came apart like wet paper. The Blood Ward had stood for 4 years, maintained by the reluctant love by proxy of Petunia Dursley's resentful presence, anchored to the bloodline and reinforced annually by Albus Dumbledore himself on the 1st of September. It was, by the standards of such things, an extraordinary piece of magic. A masterwork. Something that had kept a lightning bolt-scarred child safe from the remnants of a Dark Lord's followers while the world rebuilt itself. It lasted approximately 4 seconds against the unfiltered accidental magic of a 5-year-old who had been hungry and frightened and alone for too long. The ward didn't just fail. It shattered. The magical signature of the breaking cascaded outward through the ley network the way a crack races through ice, fast, branching, unstoppable. It hit the monitoring charms on the Hogwarts ward detection array and set off a silent alarm in a tower that nobody was currently watching. It triggered 3 separate ministry sensors that filed automated reports which would sit unread in a queue for 11 days. And it hit, with particular precision, the detection ward that Gringotts Bank maintained on every family account with a standing protection magic clause. That one didn't go unread. Gringotts Bank, London. 9:47 p.m. The night shift at Gringotts was skeleton by human standards, but goblins had different notions about what constituted adequate staffing. The vaults didn't sleep. Neither did the accountants. Ragnok was 63 years old by goblin reckoning, which put him somewhere between seasoned and formidable, and he had spent 41 of those years working accounts. He was not a large goblin, few were, by human measurement, but he had the particular physical presence of something that had compressed itself under enormous professional pressure for decades and emerged denser for it. His fingers, currently moving a quill across a quarterly variance report, were long and exact. He did not rush. He did not make errors. He had been offered senior account manager positions at 3 other vaults in the British Isles and had declined all of them because Gringotts held the most interesting accounts and Ragnok, above all else, was interested in his work. The alert stone on his desk lit up red. Not the ordinary amber of a triggered standing order or the pale blue of a scheduled notification. Red. The specific red that meant a protection magic clause had activated, which meant something structural had changed with a family account, which meant someone needed to be called. Ragnok looked at the stone for a moment. Then he set down his quill, crossed his office in 4 steps, and picked it up. The account identification carved into the base of the stone read, Potter, J.C., Primary Vault and Subsidiary Holdings. He hadn't looked at this account since the initial probate filing 4 years ago, when James and Lily Potter had been listed as deceased and the account had been placed in a holding status pending appointment of a legal guardian. He remembered that filing. He remembered it because the guardian appointment had come through unusual channels, not through Gringotts, as was standard for a wizarding family account, but through the Ministry of Magic, and specifically through the office of Albus Dumbledore, who had submitted paperwork claiming emergency guardianship authority under a wartime provision of the Wizarding Families Act of 1943. Ragnok had not been satisfied with that filing at the time. He'd raised a flag internally. The flag had been reviewed by his supervisor, who had reviewed it with their supervisor, and eventually the message had come back down the chain: the political situation is sensitive, the account is stable, leave it alone. He had left it alone. He was not proud of that. He looked at the red stone for another moment. Then he walked to the door of his office and opened it onto the corridor where 3 junior accountants were working late. Clearwater, he said, to the youngest of them. Pull the complete file on the Potter account. Primary Vault, all subsidiaries, and any connected trust or proxy accounts flagged in the last 40 years. Physical ledgers and awarded crystal records. Bring them to conference room 3. The junior accountant looked up. All of them, sir. The connected accounts alone would take. I didn't ask for a time estimate, Ragnok said. I asked for the files. Conference room 3. 40 minutes. He went back into his office and lifted a different stone from his desk, a communication stone, this one, keyed to the Gringotts solicitor on night call. He pressed it once, then spoke clearly. This is Ragnok, Senior Account Manager, Night Division. I need a legal review of the Potter account protection clause and the existing guardianship documentation. Tonight. Now, preferably. A pause, then a groggy voice. It's nearly 10 o'clock. The Potters, Ragnok said, are one of the 5 wealthiest and most politically significant accounts in this building. Their protection ward just failed and I've had a red alert on my desk for 8 minutes and no one has called me back with an explanation. So yes. Tonight. Now. He set the stone down. Then he pulled the Potter file, the thin initial one he'd kept in his personal records, and opened it to the page he'd flagged 4 years ago. Guardianship of Minor Heir, Harry James Potter, D.O.B. July 31, 1980, granted to Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore under emergency wartime provision, effective November 3, 1981. Minor placed with Muggle relatives under blood protection ward. Account held in abeyance pending minor's majority. Ragnok read this for the first time in 4 years. Then he turned to the next page, which contained the pre-existing Potter family account charter, the governing document that had been in place since 1842 and superseded any ministry guardianship provision that conflicted with it. Clause 7, Paragraph 4, Subsection C. In the event of the failure or destruction of any active protection ward tied to a Potter family blood heir, the Bank of Gringotts is legally and magically obligated to conduct a full audit of all Potter holdings, trusts, proxy accounts, and connected financial instruments within 72 hours of said failure, and to present findings directly to the senior living heir regardless of age or legal minority status, as the heir's interest supersedes any secondary guardianship arrangement in matters of account integrity. Ragnok set the file down very carefully. He had been doing this for 41 years. He knew what it meant when a ward failed on a minor's account. He knew what it meant when that minor's account had been held in abeyance by an external guardian for 4 years without a single audit. And he knew, with the particular cold clarity of a professional who has seen human wizards behave badly in the vicinity of large amounts of money before, that when he and his team spent the next 48 hours going through 40 years of Potter financial records, they were not going to like what they found. He went to conference room 3 to begin. Number 4, Privet Drive was very quiet in the way that a house becomes quiet after something frightening has happened and nobody quite knows what to do about it yet. Harry was standing in the hallway outside the blown-off cupboard door, his hand still buzzing, looking at the destruction with an expression that was less afraid and more confused. The door had not just fallen, it had hit the opposite wall hard enough to dent the plaster. The hallway light was out. The kitchen light was out. All of them. He could hear the rain outside, very clearly now, as though the silence of the house had made everything louder. Vernon appeared at the kitchen doorway first, Petunia just behind him with one hand pressed over her mouth and both eyes wide in the specific way that meant she was somewhere between fury and fear and couldn't decide which to pick. Dudley was somewhere upstairs, very quiet, which was how Dudley got when things happened that he couldn't shout about. Vernon looked at the door on the floor. Then he looked at Harry. His face did the color progression, from white to pink to the deep parliamentary red that meant something bad was about to happen, and then it stopped. It stopped because Harry looked at him with eyes that were very green and very steady, and the buzzing in the house hadn't quite gone away. It was still there in the walls, in the floor, in the faint vibration of the window frames. And whatever Vernon Dursley was, a bully, a coward, a man who had spent 4 years taking out his terror of the magical world on the smallest possible target, he was not, at bottom, stupid about self-preservation. He looked at Harry. He looked at the door on the floor. He looked at the cracked mirror at the end of the hall that he hadn't noticed yet, but noticed now. He said, very carefully, "Go to bed." "The cupboard door is on the floor," Harry said. "Then go to Dudley's second room." Harry looked at him for another moment. Then he walked past him, up the stairs, into the small box room that Dudley used to store his overflow of broken toys, and he lay down on the dusty bed that had a mattress but no sheets, and he stared at the ceiling, and after about 10 minutes he fell asleep. He didn't know that 40 miles away, in the sub-basement of a white marble building in London, a goblin named Ragnok had just opened a ledger from 1958 and found the first of what would eventually turn out to be 273 unauthorized transactions. He didn't know that the ward that had been keeping him, theoretically, safe was gone, that the magical protections Dumbledore had so carefully constructed had come undone in about 4 seconds of uncontrolled 5-year-old feeling. He didn't know any of it yet. He just knew that he'd been given a real bed, for the first time in his memory, and that tomorrow he was going to be in enormous trouble for the door, and that the buzzing in his hands had, for the first time in a long time, gone completely quiet. He slept better than he had in months. The rain kept on through the night. By 2 a.m, conference room 3 at Gringotts was covered in ledgers. Ragnok stood at the head of the long stone table and looked at what 4 hours of preliminary cross-referencing had produced, and felt something that he generally didn't permit himself to feel at work: anger. Not the hot kind. The cold kind. The kind that settles in the chest like sediment and stays. The senior solicitor, a goblin named Griphook the Elder, not to be confused with Griphook the junior vault-runner, who was an entirely different and considerably less impressive individual, sat across from him with a stack of marked ledger pages and the expression of someone professionally obligated to remain composed in the face of something professionally outrageous. "Walk me through it from the top," Ragnok said. "From the beginning?" Griphook the Elder looked at his stack. "That would be 1952. The first irregular transaction we flagged, the diversion of the Potter Muggle Technology Investment Fund, established by Fremont Potter in 1949, was authorized on December 14, 1952, by a Ministry Cultural Preservation Board directive that we can no longer find any record of in Ministry archives. Convenient. Quite. From there, the pattern continues. Small diversions at first, minor investment accounts, small property easements on the Potter secondary estates. By 1965 they're moving Fremont Potter's potion patents, not the rights to the potions themselves, but the subsidiary licensing trusts that were generating income without requiring active management. Someone was very careful to take only things that weren't being watched. The Potters were Aurors, Ragnok said. James Potter and his father both. They weren't accountants. No. And whoever was doing this knew that. Griphook the Elder turned a page. The activity increases significantly in 1970. By then we're looking at property deeds. 3 of the Potter secondary estates are quietly reclassified through Ministry Housing Authority transfers, and the income from them begins flowing into a holding account that doesn't bear the Potter name. What name does it bear? That's where it gets interesting. Griphook the Elder looked up. The holding account is a charitable trust. It's called the Preservation of Wizarding Heritage Foundation. It was established in 1968 by a consortium of old families, and it exists, on paper, to fund cultural preservation projects. In practice, it appears to serve primarily as a receptacle for redirected wealth from several old blood families who have been deemed politically inconvenient. Ragnok was quiet for a moment. Several families. Not just the Potters. Not just the Potters. We've found similar patterns in the McKinnon account, the Meadows account, and, this one I flagged specifically for legal review, the Black Family Secondary Trust, which had a separate diversion beginning in 1975. Though in the Black case, the primary account remained intact. They were only taking from subtrusts. Who authorized the transactions? Ragnok's voice was very flat. Every one of them should have a signatory. Most of them do. Griphook the Elder hesitated, which was unusual for him. The authorizations come from 2 sources, primarily. The first is a rotating series of ministry officials, most of whom I don't recognize, low-level bureaucrats who have since retired or died, the sort of names you'd never remember unless you were specifically looking for them. They're the hands on the pen. But the second source, he set a page on the table and turned it so Ragnok could read it. The second source is the signature that appears on the guardianship authorization of 1981, the emergency wartime provision, and on every major transaction that occurred after October 1981. Ragnok looked at the page. At the signature, Clear and looping and entirely recognizable to anyone in Britain who'd ever received a Hogwarts letter. Dumbledore didn't sign the original theft documents, Griphook the Elder said carefully. He wasn't involved in the pre-1981 activity as far as we can tell. But after the Potters died, and after he assumed guardianship, he signed documents that transferred control of 3 additional Potter trusts into the Ministry's administrative oversight. And by accepting guardianship through an emergency provision rather than through Gringotts, he inadvertently, or perhaps not inadvertently, gave the Ministry the legal cover to continue accessing accounts that would otherwise have been sealed pending a proper heir audit. Inadvertently, Ragnok repeated. I cannot determine intent from a signature. No. Ragnok looked at the signature for another few seconds. You cannot. What is the total sum? Everything diverted in 40 years, if we were to recalculate its present value including compounded interest on investment accounts. Griphook the Elder reached for a different sheet. Conservative estimate, accounting for only what we can directly trace and verify right now, 4.3 million galleons. The room was very quiet. 4.3 million galleons was not a number that was easy to be quiet about. It was the kind of number that had political weight, the kind that could fund several ministry departments for a decade, the kind that made the difference between a family that was wealthy and a family that was a power. And the heir, Ragnok said. The boy. Where is he? According to the last address on file, still with the Muggle relatives. Number 4, Privet Drive. Who placed him there? Dumbledore. Ragnok nodded. Then he said, I want a full audit report completed by end of day tomorrow. I want legal to draft a formal notification under Clause 7, Paragraph 4 of the Potter Family Charter. And I want someone to begin the process of identifying and freezing the preservation of Wizarding Heritage Foundation's assets pending a fraud investigation. He gathered the papers on the table into an even stack. And I want a location on every individual who has signatory authority on that foundation's accounts. This will cause considerable political turbulence, Griphook the Elder said. Good, said Ragnok. I've been doing this work for 41 years, and someone has been stealing from the children in my accounts for 40 of them. I'm not interested in avoiding turbulence. He walked to the door, then stopped. One more thing. The boy, Harry Potter. He's 5. He's living with Muggles who didn't want him there in the first place, the ward that was supposedly protecting him is gone, and he has no idea that he owns half of Wizarding Britain. He turned back. We have legal authority under the family charter to remove him from any guardianship arrangement that is shown to be contrary to his interests. Start building that case. Griphook the Elder looked at him. You're going to go get him yourself, aren't you? Not tonight, Ragnok said. Tonight I'm going to read 40 years of ledgers. Tomorrow I'm going to go get him. He left the conference room. In the corridor outside, the night watch marched its steady circuit, and deep beneath the building, in the vault with the number 713, something old shifted in the dark, though that was a different matter entirely, and had nothing to do with the Potters. Or possibly everything. Time would tell. The morning after the ward broke, number 4, Privet Drive tried very hard to be normal. Petunia made eggs. Dudley ate 4 of them and demanded more. Vernon read the paper with the aggressive concentration of a man who has decided that if he doesn't acknowledge something it might go away. Harry came downstairs from Dudley's second room, the first time in his memory he'd come down the stairs instead of out of the cupboard, and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the eggs. Nobody said anything about the door in the hallway. It had been propped back against the wall by someone in the night, which meant Vernon had been up and moving things around at some hour, which was its own kind of interesting. Petunia put a plate in front of Harry with 1 egg on it. This was more than he usually got. He ate it in silence. Dudley watched him sideways with the calculating look that preceded either a taunt or an attempt to take whatever Harry had. But something about the previous night seemed to be sitting heavily on Dudley, too, not fear, exactly, more confusion, the look of a child who's seen the rules of the world operate in a way that doesn't match his understanding of them. Vernon put down his paper and cleared his throat. "We'll be speaking to a carpenter about the door," he said, to the table generally. "Yes, Vernon," Petunia said. "These things happen," Vernon continued, in the voice of a man who does not believe that these things happen, but is trying very hard to say words. "Old hinges. In a house this age." Harry looked at the egg on his plate. He did not say anything about old hinges. "You'll behave yourself today," Vernon said, now looking directly at Harry. "And this weekend. And from now on." "All right," Harry said. Vernon nodded. Petunia went back to the stove. Dudley picked up his fork. The morning continued. Harry spent the day in the garden, which was permitted on days when Dudley didn't want to be in the garden. He sat in the corner near the fence where the grass grew longer because the mower couldn't quite reach, and he watched the ants work in the dirt, and he thought about the previous night, about the feeling in his chest, the pressure that had built and built until it had nowhere left to go, and what had come out of it. He'd broken the door, he knew. He'd made it happen somehow, without meaning to. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, the hair regrowth, the glass incident with the Cub Scouts. Once on the school playground a boy named Piers had been chasing him and Harry had somehow ended up on the school roof without quite knowing how, but it had never been this big before. Nothing had ever been this loud. He wasn't scared about it. That surprised him, a little. He thought he should be scared. But what he mostly felt, sitting in the long grass watching the ants, was something that he didn't have a word for yet. Something that sat in his chest where the pressure used to be. Something that felt, very tentatively, like a door that had been opened. He didn't know yet that the metaphor was literal. He didn't know that 40 miles away, in a stone-walled conference room, a goblin had just found the title deed to a house in Scotland that was supposed to belong to his parents, filed under the name of a ministry official who had retired in 1979 and died in 1984, whose estate had quietly absorbed the property as an anonymous inheritance. He didn't know that Albus Dumbledore, sitting in his circular office at Hogwarts, was looking at a monitoring device that had gone still and dark at 9:47 the previous evening, and that his expression, behind the half-moon glasses and the long beard and the gentle blue eyes, was not the expression of a man who was surprised. It was the expression of a man doing very fast calculations. He didn't know any of it yet. He was 5, and the sun was out after the rain, and the ants were doing something complicated with a leaf, and the buzzing in his hands was quiet. He put his fingers in the cool dirt. Something in the garden responded, the way it always did, the way nature always seemed to when Harry was paying attention, a subtle shift, a leaning toward, like the world inclining its ear. "Hello," Harry said quietly, to no particular audience. The garden said nothing back. But the ants changed direction slightly, all at once, moving in a pattern that, if you were looking for it, was almost like a response. Harry watched them for a while. Then he went back inside for the lunch he probably wasn't going to get. The audit ran through the night and into the next day. By late afternoon, Ragnok's team had traced, verified, and documented every irregular transaction they could find in the Potter accounts going back to 1952. The number they arrived at, the full current value sum of everything diverted, was not 4.3 million. That had been the conservative estimate. The final number, including 3 investment trusts they'd found folded into the Foundation's secondary accounts, including the compounded returns on redirected potion patents that had been generating income for 30 years, including the property values on 4 estates that should have been Potter property, was 6.1 million galleons. 6.1 million galleons. The active Potter vault still held a substantial sum, roughly 800,000, untouched, because taking from the primary vault would have triggered alerts. Whoever had been doing this had been careful to steal only from the edges. Only the things a distracted, combat-focused family might not notice were gone. Only the things that moved slowly, that compounded quietly, that you'd only miss if you sat down and looked at everything at once. Nobody had sat down and looked at everything at once. Not in 40 years. Because there was always a reason not to: wartime, political sensitivity, emergency provision, Albus Dumbledore's signature on a guardianship form. Ragnok read the final report. Then he read it again. Then he signed the authorization for the legal team to begin asset freezing proceedings against the Preservation of Wizarding Heritage Foundation, and he signed the formal notification to the heir under Clause 7, and he picked up his coat from behind his office door and put it on. "Where are you going?" his deputy asked. "Surrey," Ragnok said. "The boy is 5. The boy is the senior living heir to the largest active theft case in this bank's history, and he is currently living in a muggle house with no magical protections and a family that would like him to not exist." Ragnok straightened his coat. "I'm going to go meet him." "You can't just, we need to schedule a formal, the family charter gives us the authority to make contact with the heir in the case of an active audit," Ragnok said, at the door. "I have the authority. I have the notification. I have the report. And I have 41 years of watching wealthy wizards assume that their money will still be there when they get around to looking at it." He paused. "It won't be, mostly. But Harry Potter's is going to be, because I am going to go to Surrey tonight, and I am going to meet a 5-year-old who just accidentally destroyed a masterwork blood ward with his bare hands, and I am going to tell him what he's owed." He walked out. His deputy watched him go, then looked back at the stack of reports on the table. "That," she said quietly to no one, "is going to be extremely interesting." Number 4, Privet Drive at 7 in the evening was doing its best impression of an ordinary house. The neighbors were in their gardens or had retreated inside for supper. The street had that particular end-of-weekday quality, still, suburban, faintly smelling of cut grass and someone's barbecue 2 doors down. Ragnok appeared at the end of the street as though he had always been there, which was a neat trick and one of the practical advantages of knowing which illusion charms to apply before entering a muggle neighborhood. He walked down the pavement without apparent hurry, looking at the houses with the evaluating expression of an accountant who has been given an address and is verifying that it matches the property records. It did. Number 4, semi-detached, pristine garden, aggressively normal curtains. Just like the file said. He knocked. The door was opened by a woman with a neck that was slightly longer than seemed architectural and eyes that swept over him with the controlled horror of someone who has been pretending that the world has no magic in it for so long that the presence of a goblin on her doorstep registers not as a threat but as a category error. "Mrs. Dursley," Ragnok said. He handed her the formal notification, the sealed, official Gringotts document that smelled faintly of parchment and vault dust and the particular gravity of 40 years of compound interest. "I am here on behalf of Gringotts Bank regarding the Potter account. I have legal authority under the Potter family charter to speak with the account heir. Please bring me the boy." Petunia Dursley stared at him. Then she stared at the document. Then she looked behind her into the hallway, where a small boy had appeared at the bottom of the stairs, drawn by the sound of knocking, with messy black hair and green eyes that were looking at Ragnok with an expression that wasn't afraid and wasn't excited and was mostly just, interested. "Harry," Ragnok said, past Petunia's frozen shoulder. "My name is Ragnok. I work at your family's bank. I need to speak with you about your account." Harry looked at him for a moment. "I have an account," he said. "You have several," Ragnok said. "More than you know." Petunia made a noise in her throat that might have been a word of objection, but Ragnok had already produced a second document from his coat, the audit authorization, bearing the Gringotts seal, which had a very specific legal weight in both the magical and mundane world, and held it out without looking away from Harry. "You'll find that's in order," he said. "I'm not here to cause trouble for your household, Mrs. Dursley. I'm here for the boy. He'll be returned, if that's what he wishes. But he's owed information, and I intend to give it to him." Harry had come down the last few stairs while this was happening, slowly, without being told to. He stopped at the bottom and looked up at Ragnok with the level, evaluating look that Ragnok would later describe to his deputy as not remotely like a 5-year-old's look. "Are you magic?" Harry asked. "I am a goblin," Ragnok said. "It's different." "What's the difference?" "Humans use magic. Goblins are bankers." He paused. "The distinction is important." Harry thought about this for a second, then nodded as though it made sense. which impressed Ragnok more than he let show. Then Harry looked back at his aunt, who was holding the notification document with both hands and the expression of a woman who has decided that if she stays very still, this will stop being her problem. "Can I go?" Harry asked her. Petunia looked at him. Looked at Ragnok. Looked at the document. "Be back by 9, she said, and stepped aside. Ragnok looked at her for a moment, taking in the thinness of her, the tension in her jaw, the particular quality of her not looking at the boy, and filed it away with the rest of what he'd been filing all night. Then he held the door open and waited for Harry, who pulled his trainers on without tying them properly and stepped out into the evening without a backward glance. They walked to the end of the street, where Ragnok had set up a privacy charm around a bench that the neighbors would find suddenly unremarkable. They sat down. The barbecue smell drifted over from number 2. Somewhere behind a fence, a dog barked once and went quiet. Ragnok reached into his coat and brought out a small leather folder. He placed it on the bench between them. "I'm going to tell you things tonight that will seem very large for someone your age," he said. "I'm telling you because you have a legal right to hear them, and because the people who should have told you haven't, and that is itself something I intend to address. Do you understand?" "I think so," Harry said. "Good enough." Ragnok opened the folder. "Your name is Harry James Potter. Your parents were James Charles Potter and Lily Evans Potter. They died on October 31, 1981, when you were 15 months old." Harry was quiet. He'd known this, in the vague way you know things that you've never been told directly but have assembled from fragments and silence. "Your family has held accounts at Gringotts since 1842, Ragnok continued. "You are the sole surviving heir, which means everything your family owned, everything they built, every investment and property and trust and vault, belongs to you." He paused. "It should belong to you. Some of it has been taken." Harry looked at him. "Taken by who?" "That is what I am in the process of determining," Ragnok said. "What I can tell you tonight is that for the past 40 years, money and property and other valuable things that belong to your family have been moved out of your accounts without proper authorization. A great deal of it. And no one who was supposed to be watching your accounts, no one responsible for your welfare, bothered to look." The evening light was going golden and long. Harry sat with his feet not quite touching the ground, and he was very still, and Ragnok watched his face and saw something processing there that was older than 5 years. "How much?" Harry asked. Ragnok told him. Harry was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what a galleon is," he said. "A galleon is a gold coin," Ragnok said. "1 galleon is worth approximately £5. Multiply 6.1 million by 5. Harry did the multiplication with the careful deliberateness of a child who has taught himself basic arithmetic from Dudley's discarded school papers. His eyes shifted slightly as he worked through it. "That's £30 million, he said. "Yes. That's a lot of money." "Yes," Ragnok said. "It is." Harry looked at the leather folder. At the papers inside it, the columns of numbers, the signatures, the dates going back before his parents were born. He reached out and touched the edge of one page with one finger, not reading it. He probably couldn't read the formal accounting notation, but touching it like someone confirming something real. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now," Ragnok said, "I go back to the bank and I finish the audit. And when I'm finished, I bring you the full report and we discuss what you'd like to do about it." "What are my options?" Ragnok looked at him. A 5-year-old asking what his options were. He filed that away too. "More than you currently know about," he said. "But I will tell you all of them." "That's a promise, and goblins don't make promises lightly." Harry nodded. Then he looked back toward number 4, at the lit windows and the ordinary net curtains, and something passed across his face, not sadness exactly, more like recognition. Like something falling into place. "They knew," he said. "Not a question. The Desleys. They knew there was money. And they let me live in the cupboard anyway. Ragnok didn't answer immediately. He thought about what to say, about what was appropriate to tell a 5-year-old, about professional decorum and age-appropriate disclosure. Then he thought about 41 years of experience and 40 years of theft and a small boy who had been living in a cupboard under the stairs. I don't know what they knew, he said. But I know what they did. And I know that by the time this audit is complete, those responsible for the management of your affairs will be required to account for every decision they made while you were in that house. He closed the folder. That is also a promise. Harry looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, very quietly, thank you. It was such a simple thing. No performance in it, no attempt to be older or braver than he was. Just a small child being grateful to the first adult in his memory who had come specifically for him, specifically to tell him what he deserved to know. Ragnok, who had been a banker for 41 years and was not given to sentiment, found that he had nothing to say to that. He stood up and removed the privacy charm, and walked Harry back to the door of number 4, and watched him go inside, and then stood for a moment on the pavement of Privet Drive in the cooling evening. The ward was gone. The house was just a house. He turned and walked back toward London, and the audit waiting for him, and everything that was going to come next. It was, he thought, going to be an extremely interesting year. Chapter 2, 40 Years of Bleeding. The audit report, when it was finished, was 417 pages long. Ragnok read all of it. Twice. Then he had his 3 best junior accountants read it independently and flag anything he'd missed. They found 6 additional discrepancies he hadn't caught, all of them small, all of them deliberate in their smallness, transactions designed to sit just below the threshold that would have triggered an automatic review, spaced exactly far enough apart in time to avoid pattern recognition. Whoever had architected the original theft had been extraordinarily careful. Not brilliant, exactly, but careful in the way that patient, methodical people are careful, the kind of careful that doesn't rely on being smarter than everyone else and instead relies on no one ever sitting down and looking at everything at once. Which was, as Ragnok had noted to himself on the first night, precisely what had happened for 40 years. By the 3rd morning after the ward broke, the report was bound, sealed, and sitting on Ragnok's desk next to a mug of stone-cold tea he'd forgotten about and a list of 7 names that the legal team had identified as having signatory authority on the preservation of Wizarding Heritage Foundation's accounts. 3 of them were dead. 2 had retired from ministry positions and were now living quietly in the country in circumstances that were, given their stated salaries, suspiciously comfortable. 1 was a current Wisengamot member who served on the Financial Oversight Committee, which was so perfectly brazen that Ragnok had actually stopped and read that entry 3 times to make sure he hadn't made an error. The 7th name was the one that had the most legal weight and the most political complexity and the most potential to make the next several months profoundly difficult for everyone involved. He set that name aside for now. There was an order to these things, and the order mattered. The first move was the asset freeze. The Preservation of Wizarding Heritage Foundation had offices in a building on Diagon Alley, 3rd floor, above a shop that sold enchanted furniture. The offices were modest for what was supposedly a cultural preservation charity: 2 rooms, a small reception area, a secretary who came in 3 days a week. The Foundation's public activities consisted of funding the occasional restoration of a historic wizarding site and publishing an annual pamphlet about the importance of maintaining pureblood wizarding traditions, which was the kind of ideological boilerplate that had been circulating in certain corners of wizarding Britain since before the war and which most people had learned to ignore. The Gringotts enforcement team arrived at the Foundation's offices at 9 in the morning on a Wednesday. There were 4 of them, in the formal grey coats of the bank's legal division, carrying the sealed freeze order and the supporting audit documentation. They were polite. They were extremely thorough. They went through every filing cabinet, every records box, every enchanted ledger, and every locked drawer with the methodical efficiency of people who did this regularly and did not require drama to be effective. The secretary, a wizard in his 50s who had been employed by the Foundation for 11 years and who, when shown the audit documentation, went the color of old cheese, was informed that the Foundation's accounts were frozen pending fraud investigation, that he should make himself available for questioning, and that if he felt the need to send word to anyone on the Foundation's board, he was entirely within his rights to do so, as they would be receiving their own notifications shortly. He sent a Patronus so fast it was practically still in the room when they walked in. Ragnok, reading the enforcement team's report back at Gringotts that afternoon, noted the speed of that communication with something that was not quite satisfaction but was in the same neighborhood. Let them scramble. Scrambling people made mistakes. Dumbledore's letter arrived 2 hours later. It was written on Hogwarts stationery in the precise, elegant script that Ragnok had seen on a dozen documents over the past 3 days, and it was, this was the interesting part, entirely calm. Not defensive. Not accusatory. Measured and reasonable and utterly composed in the way of a man who has been composing measured and reasonable responses to uncomfortable situations for a very long time. Dear Ragnok, it began, which was itself a move, the use of his name without title, the implication of a collegial relationship that did not, in fact, exist. I understand that Gringotts has initiated an audit of the Potter account following the recent ward disruption. I am, of course, fully supportive of any review process and am happy to make myself available to answer any questions the bank may have. As Harry's legal guardian, I believe it would be most appropriate for any communications regarding his affairs to be directed through my office, in keeping with the existing guardianship arrangement. I look forward to a productive conversation. Yours, Albus Dumbledore. Ragnok read this letter. Then he set it down. Then he wrote his response, which was considerably shorter. Dear Headmaster Dumbledore, thank you for your communication. Please be advised that under Clause 7, Paragraph 4, Subsection C, of the Potter Family Charter, the existing guardianship arrangement does not supersede the bank's obligation to communicate directly with the account heir in matters of account integrity. As the audit is ongoing, communications regarding the Potter account will be directed to the heir and his designated representatives. You will be contacted separately regarding certain documents bearing your signature that require clarification. Regards, Ragnok, Senior Account Manager, Gringotts Bank. He sealed it, sent it, and went back to work. The letter that arrived the following morning was still calm, but the calmness had a different quality, more careful, more considered, the kind of calm that indicates active management of a situation rather than genuine ease. My dear Ragnok, I appreciate the bank's diligence in this matter. However, I must express some concern about the implications of communicating directly with a 5-year-old child without the involvement of his guardian. Harry's welfare must be the primary consideration, and I am not certain that exposing him to complex financial matters at this age serves that interest. I would strongly suggest we arrange a meeting, yourself, myself, and perhaps a representative from the Ministry's Magical Guardian Office, to discuss the appropriate framework for proceeding. Albus. Ragnok read this one too. Then he put it in the file marked correspondence to address at the appropriate time, which was currently the thickest file on his desk. The appropriate time was not yet. Harry, meanwhile, had spent 3 days not knowing any of this was happening and going about the business of being 5 years old in the Dursley household with the particular self-contained focus he'd developed over years of having no one to rely on but himself. The changes since the night the ward broke were small but measurable. He slept in Dudley's second room. He ate at the table. Dudley had not attempted to take anything from his plate in 3 days, which was long enough to be a pattern. Petunia still looked at him with the tight-lipped expression of someone performing a duty they resent, but she was performing it, and that was different from before. Vernon pretended the door incident hadn't happened. This was so transparently false that it was almost funny, except Harry didn't find it funny, exactly, more interesting. The way Vernon's eyes tracked carefully away from him whenever they were in the same room. The way he'd said, the morning after, in a voice carefully assembled out of normal pieces, that Harry could use the second room from now on. Not as an apology. More as a renegotiation. Harry understood renegotiation better than he understood apologies. He accepted it without comment, which seemed to be the right answer, because after that the household found a new equilibrium. Not comfortable. But functional. He could work with functional. On the 4th day, Ragnok came back. It was late afternoon, the same bench at the end of the street with the same privacy charm, and this time Ragnok had the full audit report with him, not all 417 pages, but a summary document that he'd had written specifically for this meeting. Clear language, organized by category. He'd had the junior accountant who was best at plain speech write it. Harry sat beside him and read it. All of it. Front to back, with the careful slow progress of a child who taught himself to read from whatever came to hand and was better at it than most people would expect but still working at it. Ragnok waited without impatience, watching a boy who should have been kicking a football somewhere trace his finger under words like diversion and subsidiary and compound interest with total concentration. "What's compound interest?" Harry asked. "It means your money makes more money over time," Ragnok said. "And then the money that the money made also makes more money. And so on." Harry looked at this for a moment. "So the money they took has been making money for them?" "Yes." "For 40 years?" "Yes." Harry turned back to the report. Kept reading. When he reached the page that detailed the 4 missing estates, he stopped. "We had houses," he said. "Your family had 9 properties at the height of the Potter Estates holdings," Ragnok said. "You currently have legal claim to 5 of them. The other 4 were transferred out of the family's name between 1965 and 1978. 3 of those transfers we can challenge. The 4th is more complicated. Where are the 5 I have?" Ragnok turned to the relevant page and pointed them out. A townhouse in Godric's Hollow, separate from the cottage where his parents had died, which had been destroyed. A manor in Scotland. A property in Wales. A flat in London that had been under a maintenance charm for 4 years. And the ancestral Potter home in the Cotswolds, which was the original family seat and which had been kept out of the diversions because it was too historically significant to transfer quietly. Harry looked at the list of addresses for a long time. "I've never had a house," he said. It wasn't self-pitying. It was just a fact being stated, the way a child notes something they've observed about the world. "You have 5, Ragnok said. "Potentially 8. Harry looked up at him. "Can I see one?" "That," Ragnok said, "is actually what I wanted to discuss." The legal basis for removing Harry from the Dursley household was the simplest part of what was becoming a very legally complex situation. The Gringotts family charter clause was clear. In the case of an active audit revealing financial mismanagement, the bank had the right and obligation to ensure the heir was placed in a suitable environment to be properly informed and to make decisions regarding their account. The existing guardianship arrangement, because it had been established through emergency provisions rather than through proper Gringotts channels, was already on questionable legal ground. Add the evidence that Dumbledore's acceptance of that guardianship had, whether intentionally or not, provided the legal cover for the continuation of 40 years of theft, and the case for removal was solid. Ragnok had also, quietly, had the Muggle child protection documentation reviewed. A competent Muggle solicitor, looking at the situation, child sleeping in a cupboard, evidence of food restriction, clear emotional neglect, would have moved immediately. Ragnok held that documentation in reserve. He hoped not to need it. The wizarding legal route was cleaner and faster and didn't require navigating the considerable awkwardness of Muggle authorities becoming aware of a magical child. The notification to the ministry was a formality, but a necessary one. Ragnok filed it through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement rather than through the Magical Guardian Office, which was technically the more obvious choice, because the Magical Guardian Office fell under the authority of the Chief Warlock's Oversight Committee, which was currently held by Dumbledore, and Ragnok was not interested in having his notification reviewed by the person his notification was partly about. The DMLE received the filing on a Thursday morning. It landed on the desk of an investigative secretary who flagged it for her supervisor, who flagged it to her supervisor, and by Thursday afternoon it had reached the desk of Madame Amelia Bones, head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, who read it with the expression of a woman who has seen a great deal of professional chaos in her career and can recognize a new variety when it appears. Amelia Bones was not given to dramatic reactions. She read the filing once, then opened the drawer where she kept her private notes, wrote 3 words on a piece of paper: Potter. Gringotts. Dumbledore. Underlined all 3, and then sent a message to her secretary asking her to schedule a meeting with Senior Account Manager Ragnok at his earliest convenience. His earliest convenience was that afternoon. She was shorter than Ragnok had expected, based on her reputation. Sharp-featured, with the kind of square shoulders you develop from years of standing your ground in rooms full of people who'd rather you didn't. She wore her DMLE robes without the ceremonial additions that some officials added to signal importance, which Ragnok read correctly as the marker of someone who didn't need external signals. They met in her office, which was organized with the specific tidiness of a person who processes high volumes of complex information and can't afford to lose anything. "I've read the filing," she said, before he'd fully sat down. "Tell me what isn't in it." He appreciated that. He told her. By the time he was finished, Bones had made 7 pages of notes in her small precise handwriting, and the expression on her face was the one that competent officials get when they realize that something has been wrong for a very long time right under their jurisdiction and they didn't catch it. "Dumbledore's signatures," she said. "How many, and on what specifically?" 14 documents, post, 1981, Ragnok said. 3 of them transferred Potter Trust Management to Ministry Administrative Oversight. The other 11 are routine guardianship administration, school health forms, magical monitoring waivers, that sort of thing. None of the 11 are inherently problematic. The 3 trust transfers are. Did he know what he was authorizing? "That," Ragnok said, "is the question I cannot answer from a ledger. I can tell you that the documents were written in standard wizarding trust language, that the implications of what the transfers enabled would be apparent to any competent magical law practitioner, and that Albus Dumbledore is not an incompetent magical law practitioner." Bones looked at him for a moment. "You're not accusing him of theft." "I'm saying he signed documents that made theft easier, and that he had the expertise to know what he was signing, and that he appears not to have looked very carefully at what those documents enabled." Ragnok kept his voice neutral. Whether that constitutes negligence or complicity is a question for the Wizengamot. "The Wizengamot," Bones said, "where Dumbledore is chief warlock." "Yes. I am aware of the irony." She tapped her quill against her desk twice, thinking. "The child. What are your intentions regarding his immediate situation?" "I intend to move him out of the Dursley household within the week," Ragnok said. "We have the legal authority under the family charter. I want DMLE to formally acknowledge the audit findings and file a notification with the Magical Guardian Office putting Dumbledore's guardianship under review. I'm not trying to move faster than the law permits. But I am not leaving a 5-year-old with no magical protections in a household where he's been sleeping in a cupboard while we wait for the paperwork to mature." Bones looked at him for another moment. Then she wrote something on her notes, signed it, and handed it across the desk. "That's a formal DMLE acknowledgement of the audit findings," she said. "And my personal notation that the situation constitutes an ongoing welfare concern requiring expedited review." She held his gaze. "Don't make me regret moving quickly." "Madam Bones," Ragnok said, taking the paper, "I have spent 3 days reading 40 years of financial records that prove what happens when people decide not to move quickly. I don't intend to repeat that error." The morning Ragnok arrived at Privet Drive to collect Harry, it was raining again. Not the dramatic kind of rain, not a storm. Just the steady grey English drizzle that made everything look like it was apologizing for itself. Vernon Dursley opened the door with the expression of a man who has been expecting this and hating the expectation and was now confronting the specific misery of being right. Ragnok showed him the documents. The DMLE acknowledgement. The Family Charter Authority. The formal notification that Harry Potter, as account heir, was being transferred to a Gringotts supervised placement pending resolution of the account audit. Vernon read it 3 times. Then he called for Petunia, who came and read it, and then there was a muttered conversation in the kitchen that Ragnok waited out with patience, standing on the doorstep in the rain. When they came back, Petunia's face was doing something complicated. Not grief, Nothing as warm as grief. More like the face of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just been told to put it down, and doesn't quite know how that feels yet. His things, she said. He doesn't have much. Whatever he has, Ragnok said. Harry appeared at the bottom of the stairs 5 minutes later with everything he owned in a carrier bag, 3 changes of clothing, all of them too large and clearly Dudley's cast-offs, a pair of broken trainers, and a small glass marble that he'd found in the garden and kept for no reason except that it caught the light in a way he liked. He looked at Vernon. Then at Petunia. His expression was, not hard, exactly. Not forgiving either. Just clear. The look of someone who has decided not to pretend that things are something they're not. Goodbye, he said. Neither of them said anything. Petunia made a small movement that might have been the beginning of saying something, but didn't become anything. Harry turned and walked out. On the garden path, in the drizzle, he stopped for one moment and looked back at the house. Ragnok watched him do it and said nothing. Harry wasn't looking with longing. He was looking the way you look at something you want to remember accurately, without the fog of either bitterness or sentiment. Just seeing it as it was. Then he turned and walked on. The London property on the list, the flat, turned out to be in Marylebone, on the 3rd floor of a building that looked unremarkable from the street and was, inside, the most magical place Harry had ever been, which wasn't saying much since number 4 Privet Drive was the only place he'd ever been, but still. The maintenance charm had kept everything intact. The flat was clean, dust-free, filled with soft light that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The furniture was old but good, the kind of solid, comfortable old that felt like it had been used and loved rather than just maintained. There were books everywhere, shelves along every wall, stacks on tables, a whole section in the study that was clearly specialized magical texts and another section that looked like a personal library of novels and histories. Harry walked through it slowly, touching things with that same light-fingered attention he'd given the audit report. A ceramic pot on the kitchen windowsill that had a small plant in it, still alive after 4 years, it seemed to perk up noticeably when Harry touched the rim. A framed photograph on the mantelpiece that showed a couple laughing at something off-camera, waving. Dark-haired man, red-haired woman. Harry stood in front of that photograph for quite a long time. Your parents lived here sometimes, Ragnok said, from the doorway. Before Godric's Hollow, they kept this flat. Your father used it during his Aura years. Harry looked at the photograph. The couple in it kept waving, the way wizarding photographs did, stuck in their moment of happiness, unaware of what came after. He looks like me, Harry said. It came out surprised, like he'd known it intellectually but hadn't felt it until right now. You look like him, Ragnok said. You have your mother's eyes, apparently. Though I wouldn't know, I never met them. Harry reached out and straightened the photograph on its shelf, an inch to the left, just to have something to do with his hands. Is this mine now? He asked. The flat? It was always yours. We're just clarifying the paperwork. Harry turned and looked at him with those green eyes that did that thing of seeming older than the rest of his face. Who's going to stay with me? He asked. Not afraid, not demanding, practical. I've arranged for a goblin liaison to be present during the audit process, Ragnok said. Her name is Varka. She's been briefed on the situation. She'll be here by this afternoon. He paused. There will also be groceries arriving. Real groceries. I took the liberty. Something moved in Harry's face, very briefly. Then it settled back into that level composure. Thank you, he said, for the second time. Still no performance in it. Don't thank me yet, Ragnok said. We have a meeting with the Ministry next week. The Ministry of Magic meeting was Dumbledore's idea. Or rather, it had been framed as Dumbledore's idea, but Ragnok suspected, reading the official summons that arrived from the Magical Guardian Office, that it had in fact been initiated by Dumbledore through 3 intermediaries so that it appeared to come from neutral institutional authority rather than from a specific individual with specific interests in the outcome. That was the interesting thing about Dumbledore. Ragnok had decided over the course of a week of dealing with him through documentation. He never did anything directly that could be done more effectively at one remove. The guardianship itself was a prime example. He'd never taken Harry in personally. He'd placed him with the Muggles, at an address that appeared on no formal wizarding registry, maintained through a protection ward that only worked as long as Dumbledore periodically renewed it and no one else checked it. Visible enough to seem responsible. Removed enough to maintain deniability. Clever. Not dishonest, exactly. The distinction was very narrow, but it existed, and Dumbledore was standing in it with both feet. Ragnok brought the audit report, the DMLE acknowledgement, and Griphook the Elder as his legal representative. He also, after some internal debate, brought Harry. This was not standard. Bringing a 5-year-old to a ministry meeting was unconventional at best and the sort of thing that could be characterized as exploitative or theatrical. Ragnok had weighed this carefully. His conclusion was, Harry had a legal right to be present for discussions about his own account, the family charter supported his attendance, and there was an additional practical consideration which was that everyone in that meeting would have a much harder time performing concern for Harry's well-being while Harry was sitting 3 feet away watching them do it. Harry, when told he was coming, had asked only one question, "Do I have to be quiet?" "You can speak when I indicate it's appropriate," Ragnok said. "What if it's obvious something needs to be said?" Ragnok looked at him. "Use your judgment. But don't perform." Harry had nodded, and had been ready at the appointed time in the clean clothes that Varka had helped him find in the flat, some of James Potter's stored casual clothes, charmed down to a child size, which fit him well enough and were considerably better than Dudley's cast-offs. The ministry meeting room was long and formal, with the institutional smell of bureaucracy and the particular lighting that powerful people preferred for discussions they wanted to control. 3 ministry officials sat on one side. Ragnok and his team and Harry on the other. Dumbledore arrived last, which was a choice. He walked in with the unhurried gravity of someone who has never had to worry about being the most important person in any given room, and he was, Ragnok noted this without judgment but with precision, precisely as warm and grandfatherly as you'd expect. Twinkling eyes. Small smile. The careful projection of benevolent wisdom that had probably worked, on almost everyone, for the past 40 years. He looked at Harry and his expression did something very interesting. It was subtle, so subtle that anyone not actively watching for it would have missed it, but Ragnok was actively watching. Surprise. Controlled immediately. But genuine. Dumbledore had not expected Harry to be here. "Harry," he said, settling into his chair. The warmth in his voice was real, which was the complicated part. It was genuine warmth, the affection of someone who did, in his way, care. That was always the complicated part with people like Dumbledore. "I understand you've been spending time at your family's London property." "Yes," Harry said. "I hope you're comfortable there. It's a lovely place. Your father was very fond of it." "I know," Harry said. "I saw the photographs." A pause. Small. Nearly invisible. "Of course," Dumbledore said. "I should have, there are things I should have told you sooner, Harry. I want you to know that everything I've done has been in your best interest, even if the execution wasn't always, Headmaster Dumbledore." Ragnok's voice wasn't loud. "It didn't need to be. We're here to discuss the audit findings, not to have a personal conversation. Shall we proceed?" Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Something in those blue eyes did a very fast assessment, and Ragnok let it happen, because he had nothing to hide and Dumbledore was going to reach accurate conclusions whether Ragnok let him or not. "Of course," Dumbledore said, and folded his hands on the table. The audit report went across the table, the full 417 pages, with a cover summary written in legal language that was, nonetheless, not ambiguous. Ragnok watched the ministry officials receive it. Watched the one on the left, a man named Fudge who was apparently being considered for a future ministerial role, look at the cover and then at Dumbledore with the look of a man calculating political weather. Dumbledore read the cover summary with perfect stillness. "This is a comprehensive document," he said, when he'd finished. "I have some concerns about the interpretation of the pre-1981 transactions, which predate my involvement with the account significantly." "The pre-1981 transactions are one concern," Ragnok said. "The post-1981 trust transfers are another. These are the ones bearing your signature." "I signed documents authorizing the Ministry to manage certain trust accounts on Harry's behalf," Dumbledore said. "I believe that to be consistent with standard guardianship practice during an unstable period." "Did you read the documents you signed?" Another pause. "Shorter than the first one, and more carefully controlled." "I signed a number of documents during that period," Dumbledore said. "I relied on advisors for the specific technical details." "Your advisors," Ragnok said, "were from the same ministry offices that were subsequently found to have signatory authority on the Foundation accounts receiving the diverted funds." The room was quiet. Fudge shifted in his chair. The official on the right cleared his throat. Dumbledore remained absolutely still, and in that stillness Ragnok could see, very clearly, the thing he'd been trying to determine for a week. The question of whether Dumbledore had known. He hadn't known about the diversion itself. Ragnok was certain of that now, watching his face. The shock was too internal, too quickly managed, too real, not the managed surprise of someone performing ignorance, but the genuine shock of a man who has just understood that something he signed enabled something he didn't intend. But he'd also not looked. He'd had every reason to look and every opportunity to look, and he'd chosen, each time, to trust his advisors and sign the paper and move on to the next thing. Because looking too closely at Harry Potter's financial arrangements was a kind of opening of a door that Dumbledore, whatever his reasons, had not wanted opened. That was the distinction again. That very narrow line. Harry had been quiet through all of this, sitting beside Ragnok with his hands in his lap and his eyes moving between speakers. Now, in the silence that had followed Ragnok's last statement, he said, in a voice that was clear and entirely without drama, "Did you know that I was sleeping in a cupboard?" Dumbledore looked at him. Something crossed his face that was more human than anything he'd shown so far, something that looked like it might have been, if you were feeling generous, close to regret. "I knew your living situation was not ideal," he said. "I believed the protection the ward provided outweighed." "The ward is gone," Harry said. "I broke it. There's no protection anymore. And I was sleeping in a cupboard." "I understand, Harry, and I'm not asking you to explain it," Harry said. "I just wanted to make sure you knew." The room was very quiet again. Fudge was looking at Harry with the particular expression of a politician who has just recalculated something. The ministry official on the right had stopped clearing his throat. Dumbledore sat with his hands folded and his expression composure, and underneath the composure something that was working very hard. "I think," Ragnok said into the silence, "that we have sufficient grounds to proceed. The DMLE has formally acknowledged the audit findings. We will be moving forward with the asset freezing of the Foundation and the investigation of its principals. With regard to the guardianship arrangement, Gringotts is formally filing a challenge under Clause 7 of the Potter family charter. Harry will remain in the Marylebone property under Gringotts' supervised care pending resolution of the guardianship question. The Wisengamot will need to review. The family charter predates the Wisengamot's current guardianship code," Griphook the Elder said, speaking for the first time. His voice was dry and precise. "The charter's provisions are self-executing in cases of account compromise. They do not require Wisengamot approval. They require only the signature of the account heir." He looked at Harry. "Or, given the heir's age, his formal indication of agreement." Harry looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means if you say you want to stay in the Marylebone flat and have Gringotts manage your affairs, the charter gives you the right to do that regardless of what anyone else says." "Yes," Harry said. "That's what I want." "Noted," Griphook the Elder said, and wrote it down. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment. The twinkling in his eyes was gone, replaced by something more direct, more honest than his usual presentation, something that was actually, Ragnok thought, probably the closest to his real face that any of them had seen. "I would ask," Dumbledore said quietly, "that you allow me the opportunity to speak with you. Not here, not officially. Just, to talk." Harry looked at him for a moment. "When the audit is finished," he said. "When I know everything. Then we can talk." Dumbledore studied him, the small figure in the charmed-down adult clothes, the two big glasses, the green eyes that didn't look away. "Of course," he said. "That seems entirely fair." It was the most honestly he'd spoken in the whole meeting. Outside the ministry, standing in the grey London afternoon at the visitor exit point, Harry looked up at the sky for a moment. "What happens next?" he asked. He'd been asking this regularly, Ragnok had noticed. "Not anxious. Strategic. The investigation into the Foundation principles continues," Ragnok said. "We'll be pushing to have the Wizengamot open a formal session on the account findings. There's also the matter of Sirius Black." Harry looked at him. "Who is Sirius Black?" "Your godfather. He was imprisoned for a murder that the audit evidence suggests he may not have committed, and the circumstances of his imprisonment are connected to the people who were managing the theft." Ragnok paused. "His case will take longer. The Wizengamot does not move quickly, and Azkaban does not give back what it's taken lightly." Harry was quiet for a moment, processing this. A godfather. A person who should have been his family, who was in prison, who might not have done what they said. "Is he alive?" Harry asked. "As of our last check, yes." "Good," Harry said. "Then, I want to know about him. Everything. I'll have a file prepared." Harry nodded. He started walking, hands in the pockets of his father's charmed-down jacket, a small figure moving through the grey London street with the self-possessed bearing of someone who had decided something this morning and was now carrying it forward. "Ragnok," he said, without turning. "Yes. Thank you for bringing me to the meeting. Some of them didn't want me there." He glanced back, briefly. "I could tell. You were the most important person in the room," Ragnok said. "It would have been inappropriate to leave the most important person out." Harry looked at him for a moment. Then he faced forward and kept walking. 40 years of bleeding, and it had taken one night of accidental magic from a 5-year-old to open it all up to the light. Ragnok walked beside him through the London grey, carrying 417 pages of evidence and the very specific feeling of someone who has spent 41 years doing their job correctly and is only now being given the room to do it. It was enough. For now, it was enough. The rest would come. Chapter 3, The Heir of Potter, The Blood of Peveril. The inheritance test was Griphook the Elder's idea, and he brought it up on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the ministry meeting, in the kitchen of the Marylebone flat, while Harry was eating toast and reading the Sirius Black file that Ragnok had promised him. It was a substantial file. Ragnok didn't do insubstantial. Harry had been reading it in pieces over the past few days, the way he read everything, methodically, going back over sections that didn't quite make sense until they did, making small marks in the margins with a pencil because he'd decided that if these were his files he was allowed to write on them. Varka, the Goblin liaison, had not objected to the pencil marks. She'd brought him a better pencil, actually, without being asked, which Harry had taken as a positive sign about her general approach to things. The file on Sirius Black was not pleasant reading. Peter Pettigrew. The Fidelius Charm. 12 muggles dead on a street in London and Sirius Black the only wizard left standing when the smoke cleared, laughing, people said, though the Aura reports disagreed about whether what he'd been doing was laughing. The trial, or rather, the absence of a trial, which was the thing that had snagged in Ragnok's notes and wouldn't let go. No trial. No Veritaserum. No formal presentation of evidence. A ministry official signed authorization and then Azkaban, fast and quiet, in the way that things get done fast and quiet when the people doing them are very sure they're right and very uninterested in being questioned about it. Crouch, Bartemius. Senior ministry official. The authorization bore his signature. Harry had found that name in both the black file and in the audit report. Not as a principal in the Foundation, but as the ministry official who had expedited Sirius Black's imprisonment and who had, 2 years earlier, signed off on several of the ministry administrative transfers that had moved Potter Trust Management into vulnerable territory. Not the same crime. But the same hand. And that was the kind of thing you didn't ignore. He was working through this, toast going cold at his elbow, when Griphook the Elder appeared at the kitchen door and said, "Good morning. We should discuss the inheritance test." Harry looked up. "What's that?" Griphook the Elder came in and sat across from him with the deliberate movement of someone who has decided to have a formal conversation in an informal space and is adjusting to the context difference. "When a wizarding heir comes into their inheritance under unusual circumstances," he said, "it is standard practice to conduct a blood inheritance test. A drop of blood on a prepared parchment. It tells you the full scope of what you've inherited, all bloodline connections, all magical inheritances, all titles and properties and affiliations that pass through blood rather than through a standard will." He paused. "Given the scale of what we've uncovered in the account audit, and given certain anomalies in your parents' own inheritance documentation, I believe it would be advisable to conduct one." Harry set down the Sirius file. "What kind of anomalies?" "Your mother's family magic," Griphook said. Lily Evans Potter was Muggle-born, which means she had no prior wizarding family connections, officially. But the level of magical power she demonstrated, particularly in areas of ancient magic and protection charm work, was inconsistent with what Gringotts typically observes in first-generation magical individuals. There are old families, very old families, pre-Norman in some cases, whose magic went dormant for generations before surfacing again. The Evans bloodline may be one of those. He let this sit for a moment. Your father's line is also more complex than the standard Potter family history suggests. The Potter name is relatively recent, historically speaking. The blood it carries is considerably older. Harry looked at him. How much older? That is what the test would tell us. Harry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do it." The test required a dedicated ritual space, which the Marrowbone flat didn't have, so Ragnok arranged to use one of Gringotts' consultation rooms, a small stone chamber 2 floors below the main banking hall, used for exactly this kind of work. The walls were carved with accounting runes, very old, and the room smelled of parchment and something faintly mineral, like the earth deep underground. Harry sat at the stone table. Griphook the Elder prepared the parchment, a piece of vellum so old it had gone the color of old cream, covered in a fine grid of waiting runes that would activate on contact with blood. Ragnok stood to one side with his arms folded and the expression of a professional waiting to be surprised. "This will sting for a moment," Griphook said, producing a small silver instrument with a needle point. "Fine," Harry said. The needle. A single drop of blood, very red, falling onto the vellum. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then the waiting runes ignited all at once, gold light bleeding through the grid and flowing toward the center, and the parchment began to write. It wrote slowly at first, the way revelation tends to arrive, tentatively, then all at once. Harry James Potter. Born July 31, 1980. Heir to the ancient and noble house of Potter. This was expected. Ragnok watched without expression. Heir to the ancient and noble house of Peveril, through the direct patrilineal descent of Charles Potter, died in 1979, from Iolanthe Peveril, born in 1214, daughter of Ignotus Peveril. Ragnok's arms unfolded. Heir to the ancient and noble house of Gryffindor, through the matrilineal descent of Lily Evans Potter from the Gryffindor cadet line, dormant since 1743, reactivated upon demonstration of sufficient magical power in the bloodline. That's, Griphook the Elder began. "Keep reading," Harry said. Heir to the ancient and most noble house of Slytherin, through conquest rights established November 1, 1981, upon the survival of and magical resistance to the killing curse cast by Tom Marvolo Riddle, last acknowledged heir of Slytherin. Conquest inheritance activated. The room was completely silent. Magical classification, scion of the 4 founders. Status, unprecedented in recorded history. Hereditary seats claimed, 4. Wisengamot proxy votes controlled through hereditary right, 41. The parchment stopped writing. Ragnok looked at it. Then he looked at Harry. Then he looked at Griphook the Elder, who was looking at the parchment with the expression of a man who has spent 70 years in inheritance law and has never seen anything like this and is not entirely certain he is awake. 4 founders, Harry said. He was reading the parchment with the same careful attention he gave everything. What does that mean? It means, Ragnok said, slowly, that you are the hereditary heir to Godric Gryffindor, Salazar Slytherin, and the Peverell line, which is connected to 2 of the other founders through marriage alliances made in the 12th century. He stopped. It means you hold more ancestral Wisengamot votes than any currently seated member. It means, Harry, the political structure of Wizarding Britain is built on a foundation of hereditary seats, and you have just been revealed as holding the cornerstones. And the Slytherin won, Harry said. It says through conquest. When Voldemort cast the killing curse at you and it rebounded, Griphook the Elder said, his voice carefully measured, the magical framework that governs conquest inheritance interpreted your survival as a magical defeat of his line. You didn't just survive. According to very old, very foundational magical law, you won. Harry looked at the parchment for a long time. So I own his stuff. In the most technical sense, yes. Good, Harry said. He doesn't need it. Ragnok sat down, which he rarely did in professional settings, but the circumstances seemed to call for it. He spread his hands on the table and thought about 41 years of experience and how utterly inadequate it was for this particular morning. There's something else, he said. The 41 proxy votes. If those are exercised in a Wisengamot session, combined with Augusta Longbottom's block, she holds the Longbottom and 3 allied house seats, you would have enough votes to force a formal inquiry into the Foundation theft and Sirius Black's imprisonment. Harry looked at him. What's the Wisengamot? The Wizarding Parliament and High Court. The body that would need to formally review Sirius's case. Then we need to go there. It's not that simple. You're 5. You can't sit a Wisengamot seat personally until you're 17, or until an appointed proxy, who can be my proxy. Someone with standing and existing Wisengamot membership. Augusta Longbottom, Harry said immediately. He'd read about her in the audit file, in the section about allied families. She'd been on the audit's periphery, her family's secondary accounts had shown similar small diversions, and she'd filed a formal complaint with Gringotts 2 years ago that had gone nowhere. She was fierce, politically connected, and currently furious about what had been done to her family's finances. She already wants to fight this. I want her. Ragnok looked at him. You've been reading everything I give you very carefully. Yes, Harry said. Is that a problem? No, Ragnok said. It is not. Augusta Longbottom came to the Marylebone flat on a Thursday afternoon, which was not how she usually conducted business. She usually required people to come to Longbottom Hall, as a matter of principle, but Ragnok had written her a letter that outlined the situation with sufficient clarity that she had, apparently, decided that principles about location could be suspended in cases of significant interest. She was a tall woman, upright in the way of people who decide at some early point in their life that they will not allow the world to curve their spine, with sharp dark eyes and the bearing of someone who has been formidable for so long it had stopped being effort. She wore a hat with a stuffed vulture on it that Harry stared at for a moment before deciding it was probably intentional. She looked at Harry with the evaluating look of someone used to assessing people quickly and accurately. You're small, she said. Yes, Harry said. My grandson Neville is also 5. You look nothing like him. He's round. You look like you've been sharpened. I've been hungry a lot, Harry said. Augusta looked at him for a moment. Then something in her face did a brief, controlled shift, not softness exactly, more like a recalibration, and she sat down. Show me the inheritance document, she said. Harry slid it across the table. She read it with her reading glasses perched at the end of her nose and her expression moving through several distinct phases: recognition, surprise, calculation, and then something that looked, underneath the controlled exterior, almost like satisfaction. Peveril and Gryffindor I had heard speculation about, she said, setting the parchment down. The Slytherin conquest right is new. And 41 proxy votes is, she looked up. Do you understand what this means in practical terms? Ragnok explained it, Harry said. I have more votes than anyone currently in the Wizengamot. Combined with my block, yes. The question is whether we can get a formal session called before Dumbledore uses his chief warlock authority to delay proceedings. Can he do that? He can delay. He can reorder the agenda. He cannot block a formally constituted motion that has the votes to pass, not legally, not under the charter provisions. She tapped the parchment. If we file this inheritance declaration and simultaneously file motions on the account theft and Sirius Black's wrongful imprisonment, we can force a vote before anyone has time to organize opposition. She looked across at Ragnok. How complete is the audit evidence? Complete enough to present in a formal session, Ragnok said. We have the full transaction history, the signatory records, the Foundation account documentation, and the current asset freeze status. The legal case for the theft is solid. And Black? The wrongful imprisonment case requires a separate track, Griphook the Elder said. The evidence we have is circumstantial, the absence of a trial, the speed of the imprisonment, and Crouch's connection to both the Black case and the Foundation signatories. To make it stick in the Wizengamot, we'd need either a Veritaserum hearing or new physical evidence. Augusta folded her hands. Or a confession. Everyone looked at her. I've spent 30 years in politics, she said. People confess when they believe they have more to gain from it than from silence. If it becomes apparent that the Wizengamot session is going to expose the Foundation principles regardless, someone will decide that cooperation is their best option. She paused. Crouch will not. He is not a man capable of that calculation. But some of the others, there's a current Wizengamot member on the Foundation accounts, Ragnok said. Hestia Carmichael. She's been on the Financial Oversight Committee for 12 years. Hestia Carmichael is also, Augusta said, with the precise satisfaction of someone playing a long game, the aunt of my closest political ally on the Family Traditions Committee. She doesn't know I know about her Foundation involvement, because the audit findings haven't been made public yet. A pause. She might be persuadable. Harry had been following this exchange with the focused attention he gave everything. Now he said, what do I have to do? Augusta looked at him. At the session, you'll sit in the gallery with Ragnok. You won't need to speak, in fact, it's better if you don't, initially. The sight of you is its own argument. She looked at the inheritance parchment again. 41 proxy votes walking into a Wizengamot chamber through the body of a 5-year-old in James Potter's clothes. That is a statement that doesn't require words. I want Sirius out, Harry said. That's the main thing. Augusta nodded. We'll do it in the right order. The account theft first, it establishes the pattern of institutional corruption that enables the Black case to be seen clearly. Then Black. Then the guardianship question formally, though Gringotts has largely handled that already. She stood, straightening her robes with the decisive movement of a woman who has made a decision and is now implementing it. I'll file the session request tomorrow morning. Dumbledore will see it by noon. We should expect a response by end of week. She picked up the inheritance parchment and looked at Harry again. Your parents would have been, your father, particularly, would have found this extremely satisfying, she said. He was always a great deal more stubborn than anyone gave him credit for. What was he like? Harry asked. It came out before he'd quite decided to say it, less controlled than his usual questions, more plain. Augusta heard the difference, and her expression did that shift again, the recalibration, the brief glimpse of something warmer than her default setting. Loud, she said. Generous. Absolutely insufferable when he was right about something, which he frequently was. She picked up her handbag. You have his eyes around the edges, even though the color is your mother's. She left. Harry sat looking at the space where she'd been, and Ragnok watched him do it and said nothing. After a moment Harry picked up the inheritance parchment and looked at it again. All those names. All that weight. He traced the word Peveril with one finger, the way he traced the audit report, the way he always touched things he was trying to make real. Ragnok, he said. The Peveril line. What were the Peverils known for? Ragnok hesitated, just for a moment, and Harry caught it, because Harry caught everything. Tell me, Harry said. There are 3 objects, Ragnok said. Very old. Associated with the Peveril brothers in legend. Allegedly crafted, the legend says, by death itself, though the actual origin is more likely very advanced magic from the early medieval period. They're called the Deathly Hallows. Harry looked at him. Do I have them? One of them, Ragnok said. Potentially. The Peveril Cloak of Invisibility has been in the Potter family for generations. According to the pre-theft property records, it should be in the primary Potter vault. What about the other 2? The stone is lost, or so the official record states. The wand, Ragnok paused. The Elder Wand is its own complicated matter that I'd rather address when we have fewer immediate problems. But it exists. Allegedly. And when we're done with the immediate problems, yes, Ragnok said. We'll address it. Harry nodded and set the parchment down with the careful, deliberate movement of someone setting something down without letting it go. Dumbledore's response to the session request came not at the end of the week but the following morning, which told Augusta everything she needed to know about how seriously he was taking it. The response was, on its surface, entirely collegial. As Chief Warlock, he was happy to schedule a formal session, and he proposed a date 3 weeks out, which was the standard minimum scheduling window for full Wisengamot sessions. Augusta filed a counter-proposal for an emergency session under the provision that allowed expedited scheduling in cases of active fraud investigation. Dumbledore responded that the audit's findings, while significant, had not yet been formally adjudicated and therefore might not meet the threshold for emergency session designation. Augusta responded that the threshold for emergency session required only the filing of a formal complaint with attached evidence of ongoing financial harm to a minor, which they clearly had, and that she was filing said complaint simultaneously with her response and would appreciate scheduling within the week. This exchange took place in writing and Ragnok received copies of all of it, because Augusta had made him a formal co-filing party, and he read each volley with the professional appreciation of someone watching a very skilled practitioner work. On the 3rd day of the exchange, Dumbledore called for a meeting. This one was at Hogwarts, his territory, his choice, and again a move, though a transparent one this time. Ragnok went. He brought Griphook the Elder. He did not bring Harry, because Harry was not the weapon here, Harry was the reason, and you kept your reasons close and clean. The headmaster's office was, objectively, the most impressive room Ragnok had ever sat in, which was saying something given that he spent his working life surrounded by the accumulated wealth of Wizarding Britain. The portraits, the instruments, the phoenix on its perch. Everything designed, consciously or not, to communicate the weight of history and the authority of the man who sat in the center of it. Fawkes was beautiful. Ragnok acknowledged this privately and moved on. I want to be honest with you, Dumbledore said, when the preliminary formalities were done. He wasn't performing now, or rather, the performance had been stripped back to something closer to the man underneath, which was still considerable but considerably less theatrical. I made mistakes with Harry's care. The living situation was not what I would have chosen if the circumstances had permitted alternatives. What circumstances prevented alternatives? Ragnok said. The blood ward required a blood relative. Lily Potter had one surviving blood relative. The blood ward is gone, Ragnok said. It has been gone for 3 weeks. Harry has been living in a family property under Gringotts supervision with no adverse magical consequences. The ward's necessity was always questionable. There are forces still loyal to Voldemort, fewer than you've been suggesting, according to the DMLE's own current threat assessment, which Madam Bones has been kind enough to share with us. Griphook the Elder produced a document from his sleeve with the timing of a man who has been waiting to produce it. The active threat to Harry Potter is assessed as low to moderate, not requiring blood ward protection specifically. Dumbledore looked at the document. Something moved in his face. I told myself, he said, and his voice was quieter now, the grandfatherly warmth replaced by something more honest and considerably less comfortable, that a difficult childhood would be, that it would temper him. Keep him humble. Prevent the kind of arrogance that sometimes accompanies great destiny. He paused. I've been thinking about that reasoning since your first letter arrived. I'm not certain it was reasoning. I think it may have been rationalization. The room was very quiet. Fawkes made a soft sound on its perch. That is, Ragnok said carefully, a more honest statement than I expected. I'm an old man who has been very sure of himself for a very long time, Dumbledore said. Certainty is comfortable. Looking closely at what your certainties have cost other people is not. He looked at Ragnok directly. I didn't know about the Foundation theft. I want to be absolutely clear about that. When I signed those trust transfer documents, I did not know they were being used to enable ongoing financial fraud. I believe you, Ragnok said. That does not absolve you of signing documents you had the expertise to scrutinize and chose not to. No, Dumbledore said. It doesn't. A pause. What do you need from me? I need you to not use your chief warlock authority to obstruct or delay the Wizengamot session, Ragnok said. I need you to schedule it within the week, as Madame Longbottom has requested. And I need you to make yourself available for questioning when it occurs. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. And Harry, he said. What does Harry need from me? It was an interesting question to ask, and the fact that he asked it separately, as distinct from what the legal proceedings needed, said something. Ragnok filed it. Talk to him, Ragnok said. After the session. He said he'd listen when he knew everything. Honor that. He said that himself. He is not what you made him to be, Ragnok said. Not unkindly. Just plainly. He is what he was regardless of what you did. The cupboard under the stairs didn't make him humble. It made him careful. There's a significant difference. Dumbledore looked at the desk. At his hands. At some middle distance where a man looks when he's reckoning with something in private. Schedule the session, Ragnok said, and stood. Do that much, and we can work with the rest. The session was scheduled for the following Thursday. In the interim, two things happened. The first was that Hestia Carmichael, Wizengamot member and Foundation account signatory, received a visit from Augusta Longbottom's political ally, her own niece, who was not subtle about what the forthcoming session was likely to uncover. Carmichael sent a letter to Griphook the Elder 3 days later indicating her willingness to cooperate with the audit investigation in exchange for a distinction being drawn between her active participation and that of the Foundation's architects. Griphook the Elder wrote back with the precise language of someone who neither encourages nor discourages without having the full facts, and scheduled a formal interview. She told them about Crouch. Not about the black imprisonment specifically, that was Crouch's alone and she'd had no part in it, but about the Foundation. About how it had been established, who had proposed it, who had attended the founding meeting in 1968. About a small group of old family wizards who had watched the Potters' progressive politics and their connections to Muggle-born witches and wizards and their growing influence in the Wizengamot, and had decided that the most effective way to neutralize a rising family was slowly, financially, invisibly, over decades, so that by the time anyone noticed, there would be nothing left to notice. They weren't Death Eaters, Carmichael said, in the Gringotts interview room, with her hands clasped tight in her lap. Some of them probably supported Voldemort ideologically, but this wasn't his operation. This was theirs. They didn't want the Potters dead. They wanted them, diminished. Why? Ragnok asked. Carmichael looked at him. Because a powerful Potter family would have changed things. Would have used that Wizengamot influence to push through blood status reforms, to expand Muggle-born rights, to dismantle the very power structures these families had spent generations building. She paused. James Potter and his father before him were on the right side of history. That's exactly why the wrong people were afraid of them. Ragnok wrote this down. The second thing that happened was that Harry asked to visit the primary Potter vault. This was a reasonable request. The vault was his, the audit had confirmed it, there was no legal reason to refuse. Ragnok brought him on the Wednesday before the session, in the rattling cart that descended into Gringotts depths with the cheerful disregard for passenger comfort that Ragnok had long since stopped noticing. Harry, for his part, found the cart extremely interesting and said so. The vault was enormous. Not the biggest in Gringotts. That distinction belonged to a family whose name Ragnok was not permitted to disclose, but substantial. The gold was the obvious thing, stacked in columns that reached most of the way to the ceiling, but gold wasn't what Harry looked at first. He looked at the other things. The books, stacked in a separate alcove that had its own lighting charm. The artifacts on the shelves, carefully categorized, labeled in his father's handwriting on small folded cards. The case of photographs, organized chronologically. The cloak, hanging on a dedicated hook, shimmering with the particular light absence of something that was genuinely extraordinary. Harry touched the cloak first. It felt like cool water, like something that was real and not real simultaneously, and when he draped it over his hand disappeared so completely that even he couldn't see it. He stood like that for a moment, looking at the place where his hand should have been. Invisibility cloak, Ragnok said, from behind him. I know, Harry said. You told me. He lifted the edge of the cloak and looked at his hand appearing again, then covered it. Appearing. Gone. Appearing. A 5-year-old testing a thing that was practically as old as the concept of magic itself. It's mine. Yes. Harry took the cloak off his hand and folded it carefully, the way someone folds something they intend to carry. He put it under his arm. Then he went to the photographs. He spent 45 minutes going through them. Ragnok waited. He'd brought a report to read and read most of it, glancing up occasionally at the boy sitting cross-legged on the vault floor with the photograph case open in his lap, working through his family's history one image at a time. When Harry finally stood up, he had a photograph in his hand, the couple from the marrowbone flat mantelpiece, the same waving and laughing, but this one showed more of the scene. They were outside somewhere, a garden, summer, and there was a baby on James Potter's shoulders with its hands in his hair. Is that me? Harry asked. Ragnok looked. Presumably. Harry looked at the photograph for another moment. Then he slid it carefully into the inner pocket of James Potter's charm-down jacket, close to his chest. Okay, he said. I'm ready. For the vault, or for tomorrow? Both, Harry said. Let's go. The night before the Wizengamot session, Harry sat in the flat's front room with the serious file and the inheritance parchment and the photograph all arranged on the coffee table in front of him. Varka was in the kitchen. The city was doing its city sounds outside. The plant on the windowsill, which had become noticeably more enthusiastic in the 3 weeks since Harry had been living here, was doing something that might have been leaning toward him. Harry looked at the photograph. At the baby on James Potter's shoulders, its hands tangled in dark hair that was exactly the same shade as Harry's and standing up in exactly the same way, which apparently wasn't a consequence of Petunia's bad haircuts at all. He thought about the cupboard. Not with bitterness, he'd put that down somewhere in the first week at the flat, set it aside with the same deliberate attention he gave everything. He'd been hungry. He'd been locked in. He'd been 5 years old with no one and nothing and the buzzing in his hands that nobody named. And one night the pressure had built past the point where it could stay pressure, and he'd broken something ancient and apparently extremely important, and everything had changed. The ward had kept him in. That was the strange thing. Not just kept bad things out, it had kept him in too. Kept him unknown. Kept him hidden in a house on a street in Surrey while his name accumulated proxy votes and hereditary seats and 40 years of stolen money and a godfather in prison. The ward breaking had been the most useful thing he'd ever done, and he'd done it because he was hungry and tired and alone and 5 years old. He hadn't done it on purpose. He hadn't known what it meant. He'd just felt things too hard and something had given way. He wondered, sometimes, what would have happened if it hadn't. If he'd stayed in the cupboard until he was 11. Gone to Hogwarts knowing nothing, owning nothing, unprepared for everything that apparently had his name on it. He thought about what Dumbledore had said in the ministry meeting. A difficult childhood would temper him. Harry looked at the inheritance parchment. Scion of the 4 founders. Status, unprecedented in recorded history. He hadn't been tempered by the cupboard. He'd just been alone in it. And alone in it, he'd figured out how to read, and how to do sums, and how to be quiet enough that Vernon didn't notice him, and how to make spiders rearrange themselves and lights go out and a door that needed opening come off its hinges. Not because difficulty had shaped him. Because he'd had nothing to do but figure himself out. There was a difference between those things too. Ragnok had been right about that. He picked up the serious file again and read the last section, the psychological assessment that Gringotts' legal team had requested from a healer who had briefly treated Azkaban inmates before the practice had been discontinued. 12 years in Azkaban by next year. What that did to a person, the report said, was not recoverable in the conventional sense. The Dementors didn't leave physical marks. They left absences. They took the things that make someone recognizably themselves and emptied them out until what remained was more like the shape of a person than a person. Harry read this section twice. His expression didn't change very much, but the plant on the windowsill moved again. "Varka," he called. She appeared in the kitchen doorway. She was small even by Goblin standards, with sharp eyes and the particular efficiency of someone who has done liaison work for 20 years and learned how to make herself essential without being intrusive. "Can Dementor damage be healed?" Harry asked. Varka looked at him. "Over time, with proper care, some of it, yes. There are healers who specialize in it. It requires a stable environment, consistent care, and the presence of significant positive emotional connections." "Like family," Harry said. "Like family, yes." Harry looked at the file for a moment. Then he put it down with all the other things and looked at the arrangement on the coffee table, the audit evidence and the inheritance and the photograph and the case that should have been serious as freedom, all of it belonging to him, all of it waiting for tomorrow. "We're going to get him out," he said. Not a question. Not a request for reassurance. Just a statement of what was going to happen, spoken in the quiet certain voice that had become his natural register over the past few weeks, ever since Ragnok had sat him on a bench in the Surrey rain and told him what he was owed. Varka looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "I believe you will." Harry nodded. He straightened the photograph in its position on the table. Then he went to bed, and the flat settled around him. The books, the photographs, the magical light in the walls, the plant on the windowsill holding itself toward his empty chair, and outside, London went about its business, enormous and indifferent and full of everything that was still to come. Tomorrow the Wizengamot. Next week the next thing. And somewhere in the foundations of a prison on a rock in the North Sea, a man who should have been his family was keeping himself alive by holding on to something that Ragnok's report said he'd been holding on to for 12 years, the knowledge that he was innocent, and the hope that someone would eventually figure that out. Harry lay in the dark and thought, "I figured it out. I'm coming." The buzzing in his hands, quiet since the night the ward broke, since the first night he'd slept in a real bed, moved through him once, warm and purposeful. Not a warning. Not an accident waiting to happen. Just a promise, made to no one and to everyone, in a dark room in London, by a 5-year-old who owned more of the world than he'd been told, and intended to use all of it. Chapter 4, The weight of names. The Wisengamot chamber smelled like old stone and old power and the particular mustiness of a room that had been the site of important decisions for so long that importance had soaked into the walls. Harry noticed the smell first. Then the size of it, the tiered seating arranged in a horseshoe around the central floor, the high ceiling with its enchanted sky showing flat gray clouds moving slowly overhead, the benches filled with witches and wizards in plum-colored robes with the silver W embroidered on the chest, some of them already seated and some still filing in. There were maybe 80 people in the chamber. Harry counted 43 before Ragnok put a hand briefly on his shoulder and directed him to the gallery. The gallery was above and to the right of the main floor, separated from the chamber proper by a low stone balustrade. Augusta was already there, straight-backed in the front row with her vulture hat and a leather folder on her knee that was thick enough to be a weapon if she needed one. She looked at Harry when he came in and gave him a single nod that contained approximately 15 separate pieces of information in it, all of which Harry received. He sat beside her. Ragnok took the seat on his other side. Griphook the Elder sat at the end of the row with 4 bound copies of the audit report on the seat beside him, waiting. Below them, the chamber filled. Dumbledore entered last. Of course. He took the Chief Warlock's seat at the head of the horseshoe with the unhurried gravity that Harry had observed in the ministry meeting, the walk of a man who understood that rooms waited for him, not the other way around. He sat, arranged his robes, and looked out at the chamber with the calm authority of someone who had presided over this space for 22 years. Then he looked up at the gallery. His eyes found Harry immediately, which told Harry something. He'd been looking for him before he'd looked at anyone else. Their eyes met for a moment, and Dumbledore's expression was the honest one again, not the performance, not the grandfather. The real face, which was complicated and tired and doing its fast calculations underneath a practiced stillness. Harry looked back at him steadily and then looked away. He had things to pay attention to. The session was called to order. The agenda was read by the chamber's recording secretary, a nervous wizard who read too fast and kept losing his place, and then Augusta stood. She had a voice that filled the chamber without being raised, the voice of someone who had learned long ago that volume was for people who hadn't yet earned attention. I am filing a formal motion under Wisengamot Procedure Article 14, Subsection 7, for the consideration of audit findings relating to the systematic financial defrauding of the Potter family estate over a period of 40 years. She set a copy of the audit report on the floor beside her. Copies of the full report have been prepared for all members. I am also filing a secondary motion for review of the circumstances of the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black, currently held in Azkaban without trial under authorization signed by Bartemius Crouch in November 1981. She paused. I will note for the chamber that I am acting as proxy for the hereditary seats of the Ancient and Noble House of Potter, the Ancient and Noble House of Peveril, the Ancient and Noble House of Gryffindor, and the Ancient and Noble House of Slytherin, as declared in the inheritance documentation filed with the Wisengamot Records Office this morning. There was a sound in the chamber. Not quite a murmur, more like the sound of 80 people inhaling at slightly different moments. 4 hereditary seats. Augusta was holding them all. The math was being done in real time by every politically literate person in the room, and from the expressions Harry could see, the quick sideways glances, the sudden stillness of several members in the middle rows, they were all arriving at the same answer. The chair recognizes Madame Longbottom, Dumbledore said. His voice was perfectly even. The motions are received. We will proceed with the account audit presentation first. Ragnok presented the audit findings. He did it without drama, which was more effective than drama would have been. He stood at the floor and walked the chamber through 40 years of financial records with the methodical precision of someone who has spent 3 weeks living inside this material and knows exactly where every body is buried. Transaction by transaction. Signatory by signatory. The Foundation's establishment. The redirected investments. The missing property deeds. The compound returns that had been enriching a small group of old family wizards for decades on money that belonged to a child currently sitting in the gallery. He put numbers on the floor that everyone could see, the 6.1 million galleons, written large on a conjured board, and next to it the 800,000 that remained in the active vault, and the difference between those numbers sat in the room like a stone. Some of the members were reading the audit report. Others were watching Ragnok. A few were watching the gallery, where the account heir sat with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the proceedings with an attention that was, Harry knew, making some of them uncomfortable. Good. Let it make them uncomfortable. That was Augusta's logic, and Harry had agreed with it entirely. Halfway through the presentation, a wizard in the fourth row, heavy-set, older, with the particular coloring of someone who has been extremely well-fed for his entire life, stood and said, "I must object to the characterization of these transactions as fraudulent." The ministry had legitimate administrative authority. The ministry official who signed those transfers, Ragnok said, without pausing in his presentation, had signatory authority on the receiving foundation accounts. That is the definition of a conflict of interest, and under the Gringotts Banking Act of 1762, it voids the administrative authority claim entirely. He looked at the wizard. "Do you have a question, or are you making a statement?" The wizard sat down. Augusta made a small mark in her folder. The wizard's name was on the foundation account list. 6th of 7. Harry had memorized all 7 names from the audit file 3 weeks ago, and he recognized the face when he looked hard enough. He filed it and kept watching. Ragnok finished the presentation and returned to the gallery. The chamber had the sound of a room that has been told something very large and is processing it. Dumbledore opened the floor for questions, which was the first moment in the session where Harry could watch him manage something. Because the questions from the members were, not all hostile, not all sympathetic, and Dumbledore was threading between them with the skill of a very experienced procedural operator, letting some questions land and cutting others short with gentle parliamentary precision. He wasn't blocking the audit findings. He was managing their impact, controlling the pace of the room's reaction, keeping the temperature from spiking. It was, objectively, impressive. And it made Harry's jaw tight in a way that he noted and filed and kept from his face. The questions lasted 40 minutes. Then Augusta stood again. "The secondary motion," she said. "Serious or in black?" Griphook the Elder presented the black case, which was shorter but in some ways more damaging, because the absence of a trial was not a complicated concept and the chamber knew it. The Wizengamot was both Parliament and High Court. It had the authority to imprison. That authority came with procedural requirements, a formal hearing, evidence presented, the accused given the opportunity to speak or to have representation. These were not suggestions. They were the foundational architecture of wizarding law, the framework that separated the British wizarding justice system from the mob justice of Grindelwald's era that the wizarding world had spent 30 years trying to put behind it. Sirius Black had been imprisoned by the signature of one ministry official in less than 48 hours after the events for which he was supposedly responsible. No hearing. No evidence presentation. No opportunity to speak. Just Bartemius Crouch's signature and a Dementor escort and a cell on a rock in the North Sea. Griphook the Elder set down the authorization document on the floor. "The imprisonment as executed," he said, "violates Articles 3, 7, and 12 of the Wizengamot's own procedural code. The authorization is, in our assessment, legally void on its face. Additionally, the primary witness to the events of November 1, 1981, Peter Pettigrew, who was supposedly killed by Sirius Black, has never had his body independently examined. The only physical evidence presented was a severed finger recovered from the blast site." He looked at the chamber. A single finger. A pause. Pettigrew was a trained animagus, Griphook the Elder continued. An animagus whose registered form was a rat. The DMLE records confirm the registration, which means the Aurors who investigated the scene were aware that the supposed victim could transform into an animal small enough to survive an explosion by any number of means. He paused again. They appear not to have considered this possibility. Or they were not given time to, Augusta said, from her seat. Yes, Griphook the Elder agreed. That is also possible. The chamber was very still. The kind of still that means something has landed. Harry was watching the faces below him. Watching the calculations being made. He'd been doing this for the whole session, not just following the arguments but tracking the room, noting who looked uncertain and who looked alarmed and who looked like they already knew this and were waiting to see how it played out. The heavyset wizard in the fourth row had not looked at the floor once since Griphook started speaking. He was looking at his hands. There were 3 other people in the chamber whose expressions had gone carefully neutral at the first mention of Crouch's name. None of them were on the foundation list. But neutral was interesting. Neutral meant known quantity. Neutral meant someone who knew something and had decided not to be visibly affected by it. Harry leaned toward Ragnok slightly. "The woman in the 7th row from the top," he said, very quietly. "3rd from the left. Why does she keep looking at Dumbledore?" Ragnok followed his line of sight. "That is Wilhelmina Sprout. Senior Wisengamot member, 28 years. She's Dumbledore's oldest political ally in this chamber." "She looks worried about him," Harry said. Ragnok looked again. "Yes," he said quietly. "She does. That means she thinks this is going worse for him than he's showing." Ragnok looked at Harry for a moment. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly what that means." The formal vote on the audit findings was not close. 61 to 19 in favor of the motion, which formally acknowledged the Foundation theft as criminal fraud, ordered the asset freeze to continue, and authorized the DMLE to proceed with arrests of the Foundation principals. Of the 19 votes against, 12 were from members Harry had identified as either old family conservatives or connected to the Foundation's broader ideological network. The other 7 were procedural objections from members who thought the audit evidence needed independent verification before a formal finding, not unreasonable, and Augusta had prepared for it by ensuring the audit was so thoroughly documented that independent verification would arrive at the same place. The heavyset wizard from the 4th row voted against. His name was Cyrus Aveling. Harry wrote it on the inside cover of his folder, where he'd been keeping notes throughout the session in small neat handwriting that had gotten considerably better over the past month of constant reading. The vote on the black motion was more complicated. Dumbledore called for a recess before it was taken, which was his prerogative as Chief Warlock. 20 minutes. The chamber broke into the noisy organized movement of 80 people who had a lot to say to each other in a short time, and Harry stayed in his seat and watched the floor like a theater audience watching the interval without losing the thread. Augusta went down to the floor. She moved through the chamber with the purposeful ease of someone who has been doing parliamentary politics for 30 years and knows exactly who to talk to in 20 minutes. Harry tracked her progress. She hit 7 people, every conversation brief, no one she spoke to walked away without looking like the conversation had been worth having. Ragnok leaned over. "Counting heads. She's getting the 4 uncertain votes," Harry said. "The ones who voted with the motion but looked like they were still deciding. She's locking them in before Dumbledore gets to them first." Ragnok looked at Augusta working the room. "She really is very good." "Yes," Harry said. "I know." Dumbledore was not idle during the recess. Harry watched him too, from the gallery, at a different kind of work, not the broad parliamentary canvassing that Augusta was doing, but something more targeted. One conversation, maybe 5 minutes, with Wilhelmina Sprout, who left the conversation looking not more worried but different. Not reassured. More like someone who has been given a framework for their worry that makes it manageable. Then Dumbledore looked up at the gallery again. Harry had been watching him so he was ready for it. He met Dumbledore's eyes from across the chamber and didn't look away, and Dumbledore held his gaze for 3 seconds, for 5, long enough to be intentional, long enough to be something other than a glance. Then Dumbledore gave him a very small nod. Not deferential. Not apologetic. Just, acknowledging. The way you acknowledge someone you're going to have to deal with seriously. Harry nodded back. Just as small. Just as level. The recess ended. The vote on the black motion was 54 to 25 in favor of ordering a formal hearing. Not a release, not yet. A formal hearing, with veritaserum, with proper evidence presentation, with the accused present and represented. What the original imprisonment had denied him. It would take time to organize, Griphook the Elder had explained. It would take careful legal preparation and medical documentation of Sirius's current condition and probably an appeal to have Azkaban administration cooperate with transferring him to ministry custody pending the hearing. None of that was instant. Harry had known it wouldn't be instant. He'd accepted that. But the vote passed, and he felt it pass, felt the shift in the room as 63 years of something wrong started, slowly, to be corrected, and he sat in the gallery with his hands folded and his face still and the buzzing in his chest that wasn't quite the same as the buzzing in his hands, warmer, different, the feeling of a door opening that this time he'd opened on purpose. After the vote, Augusta came back to the gallery and sat beside him. "Well," she said, in the tone of someone doing a dispassionate professional debrief. "That went better than it might have." "The 19 against the audit finding," Harry said. "The Foundation principals, when are they arrested?" "Crouch will be notified by DMLE within the week. The others, the Foundation board members we can identify, within the same time frame." She paused. "Crouch will not cooperate. He will hire the best legal representation available and fight it at every stage. The case will be long." "That's all right," Harry said. "I'll wait." Augusta looked at him. "You're remarkably calm for someone who just watched evidence of the systematic destruction of his family's legacy be formally acknowledged by a parliamentary body." "I've had 3 weeks to be not calm about it," Harry said. "I did that at home. Here I need to be useful." Augusta was quiet for a moment. Then she said something she probably didn't say often: "Your parents would have been genuinely impressed by you. Not because of the seats or the inheritance or the votes. Because of how you're handling it." Harry looked at the chamber below, which was emptying now, members filing out in clusters, conversations continuing into the corridors. "I'm still angry," he said. "Good," Augusta said. "Stay angry. Just keep doing what you're doing with it." Dumbledore found him in the corridor outside the chamber, which was not accidental. The corridor was wide and stone-floored, lined with portraits of past chief warlocks in heavy frames. People were still moving through it, post-session conversations happening in pairs and small groups, and Dumbledore appeared at Harry's elbow in the particular way of a tall person who has gotten very good at being unobtrusive when they want to be. "Harry," he said. "Might I walk with you?" Ragnok, at Harry's other shoulder, was present and visible. Dumbledore acknowledged him with a nod that Ragnok returned with the precise minimum of warmth the situation required. "All right," Harry said. They walked. The corridor thinned as they moved away from the chamber, the other conversations falling behind. Dumbledore walked at Harry's pace, which was smaller than his own, and didn't speak immediately, which Harry noticed and decided was strategic, letting Harry set the terms. "You said you'd listen when you knew everything," Dumbledore said, eventually. "I know more than I did," Harry said. "Not everything. I don't think everything exists yet." "No," Dumbledore said. "I suppose it doesn't. There are things still coming that neither of us can see clearly." He paused. "I wanted to tell you, not to justify myself, I'm past believing justification is useful here, but to tell you that when I placed you with your aunt's family, I believed it was the safest choice available. Not the best choice. Not the choice that served you well. But the safest." "Safe from what?" "From what remained of Voldemort's supporters. From the attention of people who would have used you as a symbol or a weapon. From a wizarding world that had just decided you were either a savior or a target, and was not prepared to leave you as simply a child." Harry considered this. He had, over the past 3 weeks, thought about this more than he'd thought about the money or the inheritance or any of the legal proceedings. The cupboard was the part that stayed with him most cleanly, in the way that personal things stay differently than institutional ones. "You could have visited," he said. Dumbledore was quiet. "You could have checked," Harry said. Not angry, just stating it. "Not officially. Just, come and seen. Whether the house was all right. Whether I was eating. You knew where I was. You could have looked. Yes, Dumbledore said. I could have. You didn't. No. Why not? Another pause. Longer. The portrait of a 16th-century chief warlock watched them pass with painted indifference. Because looking would have required acting on what I found, Dumbledore said finally. And acting would have required dismantling an arrangement I had convinced myself was necessary. It is easier, I find, not to look at the things we are not prepared to change. He stopped walking. That is not a virtue. I am aware of that. Harry stopped too. He looked up at Dumbledore, this man who was enormous in the wizarding world, enormous even physically, this man who had made decisions about his life without asking him, who had not looked because looking was inconvenient, and felt something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite the opposite. I'm not going to Hogwarts blind, Harry said. When September comes and I get my letter, I'm going knowing what I know. All of it. My family, my history, my seats, everything. Of course, Dumbledore said. And I'm going to learn everything. Not just what's on the curriculum. I would expect nothing less. And Sirius, Harry said. When he's out, when the hearing happens and he's free, he'll be my guardian. Properly. Through Gringotts. Not an emergency provision. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment. Something moved in his face, not objection, not maneuvering. Something older than that. Something that looked, if Harry was reading it right, like relief. That is exactly as it should be, Dumbledore said. Sirius was your father's closest friend. He should have been with you from the beginning. That was my failure, among the others. Harry looked at him for another moment. Are you going to try to steer things? Me, I mean. My education, what I learn, how I think. Dumbledore considered this with the directness that Harry had decided he liked in him, the honesty that came out when the performance was stripped away. Probably, he said. It's a difficult habit to break, and I believe some of what I'd want to show you is genuinely worth knowing. But, he paused. I am aware that the architecture of my previous plans for you was built on a foundation of your ignorance. That foundation is gone. Whatever comes next will have to be built differently. On what? Harry asked. On your choices, Dumbledore said. Not mine. Harry looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, then teach me what you know. Not to steer me. Just because it's worth knowing. Something in Dumbledore's face shifted, something old and tired and complicated that might have been, if you were generous, the beginning of a different kind of relationship. Not the grandfather pretending to be benevolent. Not the architect managing his instrument. Just an old man with a great deal of knowledge and the belated wisdom to offer it honestly. I would like that very much, Dumbledore said. They stood in the portrait corridor for another moment. Then Harry said, I need to go find Ragnok. We have the property visit this afternoon. The Cotswold estate. Yes. It's extraordinary, Dumbledore said. Your grandmother planted the gardens. She had extraordinary taste. A brief pause. Your father used to climb the oak tree on the east side of the main lawn when he was in trouble. Which was frequently. Harry looked at him. Which oak tree, specifically? Dumbledore's expression did something that was almost, not quite, but almost, a smile. The biggest one. Center of the east lawn. You'll know it when you see it. Harry nodded and walked back toward where Ragnok was waiting. The Cotswold estate was called Linnet Hall. The name was on the gateposts, carved in stone that was older than the lettering style, the actual carving done over something earlier that you could still see underneath if you looked, a different script, older, from before the Normans had gotten to England and renamed everything. The approach was a long drive through what had been formal grounds and had softened over 4 years of unattended growth into something wilder and more interesting. Trees on both sides that were doing the same thing the plant in the marrowbone flat did, inclining slightly, attending, the way living things apparently did around Harry. Ragnok had stopped commenting on this. It was simply what happened. The house itself was old stone, large without being intimidating, the kind of house that had been lived in by people who liked books and dogs and having people over for dinner. The kind of house that had scuffs on the front steps and a wisteria that had been allowed to do what it wanted on the south wall for long enough that it had an opinion about it. Harry stood in the drive and looked at it. "This is mine," he said. "Not a question this time." "Been in the Potter family since 1487, Ragnok said. "On the inheritance since your great-great-grandfather. Never successfully diverted because it's too historically significant and too well documented to touch quietly." "It needs cleaning," Harry said. "It needs a significant amount of work," Ragnok agreed. "The maintenance charms have been running for 4 years without renewal, which means the basics, structural integrity, weatherproofing, are intact, but the surfaces have been neglected." Harry walked up the front steps. The door opened before he touched it, which he'd stopped being surprised about 3 weeks ago. Things opened for him. He'd learned to walk through them without ceremony. Inside was the smell of old houses, wood and stone and the ghost of fires long gone. Light coming through tall windows onto floors that needed sweeping. Furniture under dust sheets like sleeping shapes. Bookshelves along every wall of the first room he walked into, which had been the library, full of books that he was going to read every single one of. He walked through the house the way he'd walked through the marrowbone flat. Touching things. Learning it. The kitchen was enormous, with a muggle range and a magical hearth side by side, which said something about the kind of people his family had been. The dining room had a table big enough for 16 and a sideboard with carvings of animals on it, foxes and rabbits and birds, natural things, not magical ones. The upstairs hallway had more photographs, and Harry went through these more quickly than the vault ones, because he was starting to know the faces now. His grandparents. His parents younger than he'd seen them, Hogwarts age, doing the things that teenagers in photographs did, laughing, making faces, caught in the middle of something. A portrait of someone much older, in robes from a century ago, who looked enough like his father to be clearly family, who was awake in the portrait in the way magical portraits are, watching Harry with the sharp attention of someone taking stock. "You're Fleamont's grandson," the portrait said. "Or great-grandson. I can never keep track of the generations." "Great-grandson," Harry said. "I think. I'm Harry." "I know who you are," the portrait said. "James's boy. You have the look. What are you doing here?" "It's my house," Harry said. The portrait looked at him for a moment. Then it said, "Well. About time." Harry almost smiled. Not quite. But almost. He went to the east side of the house and found the back door that opened onto the lawn, and he went outside, and there was the lawn, overgrown but still clearly itself, the bones of formal gardens gone casual under 4 years of independent growth, and there, center of the east lawn, was the biggest oak tree he'd ever seen. Ancient, enormous, its branches spread over a third of the lawn in a canopy that dappled the afternoon light. He stood under it. The tree was the kind of old that makes you aware of your own scale in the world. The bark under his hand was rough and warm from the afternoon sun. He could see, about 6 feet up, where the lower branches started, close enough to reach if you could jump, if you were the right kind of desperate climber. He thought about his father climbing this tree. 11, 12, 15, whatever age you were when you climbed trees to get away from trouble. Whatever kind of trouble James Potter had gotten into in this house, in this garden, before everything that came after. Harry wasn't a particularly sentimental child. The cupboard had trained most sentiment out of him as impractical. But standing under this tree, he felt something that he didn't have a word for yet, the particular feeling of a thing that has been waiting for you, that doesn't know time the way people do, that is simply here, rooted and present and indifferent to history, available to be used. He jumped for the lowest branch. Got it on the first try. Pulled himself up with the ease of a child who has spent a lot of time in confined spaces and has disproportionately good upper body strength for someone his size. Settled himself in the fork of the branch and looked out over the lawn. Ragnok had followed him outside and was standing at a respectful distance, reading something on a folded document, the way he always produced something to read whenever Harry was in the middle of a private moment. Harry had decided this was his way of providing privacy, the professional absence of staring. "Ragnok," Harry called. Ragnok looked up. "Yes. I want to live here. Not the Marrowbone flat, here. Can we?" Ragnok looked at the house. At the garden. At Harry perched in the oak tree 6 feet up looking entirely at home. "It requires work before it's habitable," he said. "So let's start. Varka will need to adjust her arrangements, she can move here too. There are enough rooms." Harry looked at the house from his branch. "I want this to be where I'm from. Not Privet Drive. Not a flat in London. Here." Ragnok considered this for a moment. He looked at the house, the old stone, the wisteria, the windows going golden in the afternoon light, with the expression of an accountant who is also, despite 41 years of careful professional calibration, capable of understanding that some decisions are not about finance. "I'll have the maintenance charms renewed by the end of the week," he said. "Restoration team can start after that. You can be settled in within a month." "Good," Harry said. He stayed in the oak tree for a while longer, looking at his house, learning its shapes and its light the way he learned everything, carefully, fully, making it real. Below him, the garden was doing the thing it did. The overgrown grass leaning slightly. The old rose bushes at the garden's edge moving in a wind that Harry couldn't feel up in the tree. The house itself seeming, in some quality of the light, to be paying attention. He was 5 years old and he owned more than most adults would see in a lifetime, and he had inherited the weight of names going back 8 centuries, and there was a man in a prison who should have been his family, and a trial to prepare for, and a school to get ready for, and a network of old corrupt men who had taken everything they could from the Potters and thought they'd gotten away with it. None of it felt too heavy. That was the strange thing. None of it felt like too much. He thought about the night in the cupboard, the buzzing, the pressure building and building. He thought about how afraid he'd been of that pressure. How he'd thought it was dangerous. Something to be suppressed. He put his hand against the oak branch and felt the tree's slow huge aliveness under his palm. It wasn't dangerous. It had never been dangerous. It had just needed somewhere to go. The letter from Azkaban came to Ragnok's desk on the same day they started the Linnet Hall restoration. It was short, written in handwriting that had clearly once been precise and had become uneven under years of hard use, but was still trying, still legible, still deliberate in its unevenness, the handwriting of someone refusing to let their hands forget what they knew. To the account manager currently managing the Potter estate, "I understand you are the person responsible for the hearing motion. I have been informed by the Azkaban administration that a formal hearing has been ordered. I want you to know, formally and in writing, that I am innocent. I know that is what everyone says. But I am innocent, and whatever you need from me to prove it, I will give you everything I have. What's left of it? Sirius Black." Ragnok read this and then walked it to where Harry was sitting at the kitchen table in Linnet Hall. The restoration team had gotten the kitchen habitable first, on Harry's instructions, because the kitchen was where people lived, eating lunch and reading through the Gryffindor family history document that Grip Hook the Elder had compiled. He set the letter on the table without saying anything. Harry read it. Then he read it again. His face did something complicated and brief that Ragnok didn't look away from, because Harry deserved to have someone witness it. The rare moment of the composure giving way slightly, not breaking, just admitting something through. The something that lived under all the strategy and the clear-eyed competence. The 5-year-old who'd been in a cupboard. The person whose family had been taken from him in a dozen different ways. Then it settled back. Harry picked up his pencil and wrote on the back of the letter, in his small neat hand, "I know you're innocent. I'm coming. H." He handed it to Ragnok. Send that to him. We can't send direct correspondence to Azkaban prisoners without, find the form that allows it, Harry said. There is one. There's a form for everything. Find it and file it and send him this. Ragnok looked at the note. The simplicity of it. 5 words and an initial, from a boy who had never met the man they were addressed to, carrying more comfort in those 5 words than most people could manage in 5 pages. I'll find the form, he said. Harry nodded and went back to the Gryffindor history. Outside Linnet Hall, the restoration team was working on the south wall, and the wisteria had apparently decided to cooperate with them. The oak tree stood in the east lawn doing what oak trees do, just being, just enduring, just holding up the sky. Inside, Harry ate his lunch and read his family's history, and the kitchen smelled like someone had been cooking here for 500 years, which, give or take, they had. The weight of names was real. He'd decided not to put it down. Chapter 5, The Wizengamot moves. 6 months passed. Not quietly. Nothing in Harry's life moved quietly anymore, and he'd stopped expecting it to. The 6 months between the first Wizengamot session and the one that mattered had the texture of a campaign, legal motions filed and countered, DMLE arrests made and appealed, the Foundation principals hiring barristers of increasing expense and decreasing credibility, Crouch fighting the fraud charges with the methodical fury of a man who has spent a career believing himself untouchable and is discovering he was wrong. Harry spent those 6 months learning things. Linnet Hall had a library with 2,000 books. He read approximately a third of them, skipping the ones that were pure theory in favor of anything practical, magical law, family history, the political architecture of Wizarding Britain, the histories of the 4 founding bloodlines. He read fast and retained almost everything, which was less a gift and more a consequence of having had almost nothing to read for 5 years and therefore treating every book like the first meal after a famine. He also had Ragnok, who was an education in himself. 3 mornings a week, Ragnok sat across from him at the Linnet Hall kitchen table and walked him through the practical management of the Potter estate, how the accounts worked, how the Gringotts charter protected him, how proxy votes were exercised, how property claims were made. He didn't simplify it. He taught it straight, the way he'd talked to Harry from the first bench in Surrey, and Harry absorbed it the way he absorbed everything, completely and with questions. He had Augusta, who came every second Wednesday for what she called political education, and what Harry privately thought of as learning to read people. She would describe a parliamentary situation and ask him what he'd do. He'd tell her. She'd tell him what he'd missed. He got fewer things wrong over time, which she acknowledged by raising the complexity of the situations. He had Varka, who was practical and dry and had an encyclopedic knowledge of Gringotts procedure and a very direct way of telling him when he was about to do something inadvisable. And he had the oak tree, which he climbed most evenings and which asked nothing of him. The hearing for Sirius Black was set for March. Formal Wizengamot session, full chamber, Veritaserum administered with independent healer verification. Crouch's arrest happened in November, 7 months after the first session. 2 DMLE officers appeared at his office at 8 in the morning and arrested him on 12 counts of financial fraud, 3 counts of abuse of ministry authority, and 1 count of conspiracy to deprive a legal heir of their estate. He was released on bail within 4 hours, which everyone expected, and arrived at his own legal team's offices within 6, which also everyone expected. He did not confess. He was not going to confess. Ragnok had predicted this and filed for the criminal trial to run parallel to the Wizengamot session rather than sequential to it, which meant both things would happen at the same time in different rooms, which meant Crouch would be stretched thin, and that was where mistakes got made. Harry was 6 by the time March arrived. He was taller. He'd stopped wearing his father's charmed-down clothes because Augusta had taken him to a proper wizarding tailor in Diagon Alley who had measured him with a tape that moved on its own and made him 3 sets of robes in dark colors that fit properly for the first time in his life. He looked, Ragnok had observed with professional neutrality, like someone who knew what they owned. The night before the hearing, Harry sat in the Linnet Hall library with the letter from Sirius. Not the one Ragnok had shown him. The correspondence had continued after that first letter, carefully routed through the form that Ragnok had indeed found, a Form 4J, prisoner, family, correspondence that had apparently existed since 1843 and been used approximately 12 times. Sirius had written to him every 2 weeks since October. The letters had started uneven, the handwriting getting worse before it got better, the content fractured in the way of someone not entirely used to being lucid anymore, and had steadied over the months into something that was still clearly damaged but was also, unmistakably, a person. A real, specific, three-dimensional person with James Potter stories and an opinion about Quidditch and a very dry sense of humor that surfaced occasionally like something breaking the surface of water. Harry had written back every time. He didn't know what to write to someone he'd never met who was supposed to be his family, so he wrote what was true. What he was learning. What the house looked like. What the oak tree felt like from the top fork on a cold morning. What the Gryffindor history said about their bloodline. Small things and large things mixed without hierarchy, which was apparently what Sirius needed. The letters got clearer every time Harry sent something new, like the writing was tethering him. He sat with the most recent letter now, which had arrived 4 days ago. The handwriting was almost steady. The content was, still serious, which was more than the healer's report had suggested possible. The report had said cognitive damage consistent with 12 years of Dementor exposure. The letters said, there is someone in here, and he is very angry, and he wants his life back. Harry put the letter down and looked at the fire. He had thought, over these 6 months, about what Azkaban did to people. Had read the medical reports, the healer's assessments, the academic work on Dementor effects. Had understood it intellectually, thoroughly, the way he understood everything. What he couldn't quite grasp, not yet, was the dimension of it that was just time. Just years. Just the specific weight of years spent in a place that ate joy and memory and the sense that anything would ever be different. He was 6. He understood time in the way 6-year-olds understand it, which is to say he understood months and seasons and the fact that things change, but the concept of 12 years was still more number than feeling. He thought about the letter. I keep thinking about the house, Sirius had written, in the most recent one. Your house. The oak tree. Can a person climb a tree when they haven't been outside in 12 years? I genuinely don't know. Harry had written back, yes. I'll show you. He sat with the fire for a while. Then he went to bed and slept well, which was a thing he could now do consistently, which still sometimes surprised him. The hearing chamber was smaller than the full Wizengamot space, a dedicated courtroom, the walls embedded with truth verification charms that hummed faintly at a frequency you felt rather than heard. The gallery was full. Word had gotten around, the way things did in Wizarding Britain, the way that particular communities' information moved, fast and slightly distorted through networks of family and connection and the lingering trauma of the war. People had opinions about Sirius Black. Most of them had been formed in 48 hours in November 1981, from the Ministry's account of what had happened, without a trial to complicate them. Harry sat in the gallery with Ragnok on one side and Augusta on the other and the cloak from the vault folded on the seat beside him, which he'd brought without knowing quite why, some instinct about having the right things present. The chair in the center of the floor was old and had chains on it. The chains weren't currently active, they were a holdover from a less enlightened procedural era, Augusta had told him, still present because no one had formally removed them and the Wizengamot was deeply resistant to removing things that had been there for a long time. They lay slack on the floor like something that had learned to wait. They brought Sirius in through a side door. Harry had been preparing for this. Had thought about what it would be like to see someone he'd only known through letters, someone who'd been his father's best friend, someone who should have been his family for the past 6 years. Had tried to construct a realistic expectation rather than an idealized one, because idealization led to being wrong about things and being wrong about things was expensive. He'd done the preparation carefully and it didn't help at all. Sirius Black was 34 years old and looked, at a distance, like someone had taken a person and left them out in weather for too long. He was tall, very tall, with the frame of someone who'd been broad before the years had taken it down, with dark hair that was long and tangled and cheekbones that were too prominent and gray eyes that were doing something complicated in the light of the courtroom. He walked without steadiness in the way of someone still learning to trust that the floor would hold, escorted by two DMLE officers who were being professionally detached about it. He sat in the chair. The chains didn't move. He looked around the chamber with those gray eyes, taking stock, and then he looked at the gallery, and Harry watched him search, watched the systematic visual sweep that was either instinct or desperation, until it stopped. He'd found Harry. Harry looked at him from the gallery. Sirius looked at Harry from the chair. In Sirius's expression was everything that the letters had implied and nothing that they'd managed to quite say, recognition, even though they'd never met, because Harry had his father's face and his father was the person Sirius had been holding onto for 12 years. Something else too, something newer. The specific recognition of the letters, of your house, your oak tree, I'll show you. Harry gave him the same small nod he'd given Dumbledore, 6 months ago in the Wizengamot chamber. Not a performance. Just, I see you. I'm here. Sirius's jaw tightened briefly, a contained thing, and he looked back at the floor. Collecting himself. The hearing began. The Veritaserum was administered by a healer who took 20 minutes establishing baselines and dosage, which Harry found, not frustrating, exactly. He understood why it had to be careful. He just wanted it done. When it was done, the questioning was conducted by Amelia Bones herself, which was a choice she'd made and communicated to Griphook the Elder's team in advance. She was methodical and fair and asked exactly the questions they'd agreed on, in the order they'd agreed on, without editorializing or leading. State your name for the record. Sirius Orion Black. On November 1, 1981, did you kill Peter Pettigrew and 12 Muggle bystanders on the street in West London? No. The chamber was very still. Did you betray James and Lily Potter's location to Voldemort? No. Who was the Potters' secret keeper at the time of their deaths? Sirius's voice, under Veritaserum, was flatter than his letters, the emotion stripped out, just the bare fact. Peter Pettigrew. Why was Pettigrew the secret keeper and not you? Because I suggested it. A pause, the flat Veritaserum voice continuing. I was the obvious choice. I thought they'd target me first. I thought switching to Peter would be safer. It was my idea. Another pause. That was my mistake. Not the betrayal. The mistake was mine. I chose wrong. Harry looked at the back of Sirius's head from the gallery. The admission was blunt and unvarnished in the way only Veritaserum could make something, all the narrative stripped away, just the bare painful core of it. Where is Peter Pettigrew now, to the best of your knowledge? Alive, Sirius said. Transformed. He's an animagus, rat form. Unregistered. He blew up the street himself before I could reach him. Blasted off his own finger, transformed, and ran. He's been a rat somewhere for 12 years. The chamber was not still anymore. The sound was low but definite, the sound of 80 people recalibrating a 12-year-old certainty. Bones continued. Do you consider Harry Potter to be your responsibility? A pause. Just a fraction of a second. Yes, Sirius said. He's James's son. He's my godson. He should have been with me from the beginning. That's, yes. No further questions, Bones said. The legal arguments took 3 hours and Harry listened to all of them, tracking the chamber the way Augusta had taught him, watching for the ones who'd already decided, the ones who were still deciding, the ones who were going to vote politically regardless of what they heard. The legal case for wrongful imprisonment was, at this stage, almost academic. The Veritaserum testimony was clear, the procedural violations were documented, and Griphook the Elder's written brief had been in every Wizengamot member's hands for 6 weeks. The question was the votes, and the votes were Augusta's work. She'd been building this for 6 months. Not just counting heads but having the specific conversations with the specific people, finding the places where principle and political interest aligned, which was where durable change happened. The 18-member block she'd assembled was solid. She told Harry this at their last Wednesday session, with the tone of someone reporting a battle assessment, not making a prediction. She didn't predict. She assessed. 18 solid, 14 probable, 12 uncertain. They needed a simple majority of the chamber, 41 votes. Harry had done the math. With Augusta's block and his own proxy votes she was exercising, they had 54 before the uncertain members decided anything. When the vote was called, it was 67 to 13. 13 votes against freeing a man who had been imprisoned without trial on the basis of a ministry official's unilateral authorization and whose innocence had just been demonstrated under veritaserum in front of the full chamber. Harry looked at those 13 votes and memorized the faces. Not with anger, with the same careful attention he gave everything. People who had voted against Sirius Black being free, knowing what they now knew, with the evidence in front of them. That was information. That was a very specific kind of information about who those people were and what they were willing to do. He wrote the names in his folder. The vote passed. Sirius Black was ordered released immediately. The chains that had lain slack on the courtroom floor gave one small rattle and went still again, as though even they felt the shift. Sirius sat in the chair for a moment after the verdict was announced, and Harry watched him receive it, the news that was also the end of a 12-year wait, which wasn't simple news and wasn't simple to receive. He sat very still. His hands, which had been folded in his lap with the careful control of someone who had been containing themselves for hours, opened and relaxed against his thighs. The DMLE officer who had escorted him in leaned over and said something to him quietly. Sirius nodded. He stood, which took him a second longer than it should have, and turned toward the gallery. Harry was already at the gallery railing. He didn't plan what to say. He'd found, over the past 6 months, that planning words for important moments produced the wrong words, because the moment was always different from the plan. Better to just be there and let it be what it was. The oak tree's easier than it looks, he said. Sirius looked at him. His gray eyes were doing that complicated thing again, and the jaw was tight, and he was clearly doing the specific work of staying assembled that Harry recognized from his own earlier weeks of learning that things could be different. Yeah. Sirius managed. There's a good branch about 6 feet up. You can see the whole east lawn from it. Sirius was quiet for a moment. Then, roughly, is there room for 2? I checked, Harry said. Yes. Something in Sirius's face broke open briefly. Not dramatically, he wasn't a dramatic man, Harry had understood this from the letters. Just a small, real, human thing. Then he put it back together, but the way it went back together was different from before, not the contained holding on of veritaserum testimony, more like something that had put itself together around a new center. I need to talk to some people, he said. Healer, probably. Various official things. I know, Harry said. Take as long as you need. I know where you live, Sirius said. And there was something in those 4 words, the dry, battered humor, the implication of normalcy, the suggestion of after this, after all this, there is something after, that matched exactly the voice from the letters. You do, Harry said. The door'll be open. The Crouch criminal trial ran parallel for 3 more weeks before collapsing, which was not how it was supposed to go and was entirely how Ragnok had expected it to go. The collapse came from inside. One of the Foundation board members, not Carmichael, who had already cooperated, but a wizard named Aldrich Vane who had been on the board since its founding in 1968 and who was 71 years old and, apparently, had decided over the course of the preceding 6 months that spending his remaining years fighting a criminal case was not how he wanted to live, provided a complete written account of the Foundation's origins, operations, and principles. Vane's testimony named Crouch specifically as the architect of the Sirius Black imprisonment. Named him not as someone who had acted on insufficient information but as someone who had acted on full information, had known about Pettigrew's animagus ability, had been told by at least one aura on the scene that the evidence was inconsistent, and had signed the authorization anyway. It also named Crouch as the person who had proposed, in 1981, using the chaos of Voldemort's defeat to accelerate the Foundation's access to the Potter accounts by pushing Dumbledore toward the emergency guardianship provision, not bribing him, not threatening him, but ensuring that Dumbledore's advisors, all of whom were either Foundation members or Foundation adjacent, recommended it as the sensible course of action. Dumbledore, in this account, was not corrupt. He was managed. Which was, in its own way, more damning, because it meant the most powerful wizard in Britain had been outmaneuvered by a small group of methodical men while he was busy being certain he was in control. Ragnok brought Harry the vain testimony on a Friday afternoon. Harry read it at the kitchen table in Linnet Hall, carefully, front to back. "Does Dumbledore know about this?" he asked. "He will when it's filed," Ragnok said. "Probably already does, he has better intelligence networks than most people know about." Harry was quiet for a moment, looking at the testimony. At Crouch's name appearing in it 7 times in 7 different contexts, each one another count on an already significant charge list. "The 13 votes at the hearing," Harry said. "Were any of them Foundation connected?" 4 of them, yes," Ragnok said. 3 more were politically adjacent, not Foundation members but ideologically aligned. The remaining 6 were, he paused. The remaining 6 appear to have been voting on the precedent question. Concerned about Veritaserum testimony being sufficient to overturn a ministry authorization without a full evidentiary review. "Procedural, not corrupt," Harry said. "Apparently." Harry nodded. "Then those 6 aren't on the list." Ragnok looked at him. "What list?" "The one I'm keeping," Harry said. "Of people who knew what they were voting for." He set down the vain testimony and looked at the kitchen window. Outside, the Linnet Hall grounds were doing the thing they did in early spring, tentative, testing, the old formal structure of the garden reasserting itself through the restoration work like something that had been waiting patiently and was now ready to be itself again. "Ragnok," he said. "When the criminal trial concludes and Crouch is convicted, if," Ragnok said. Harry looked at him. "The evidence is strong," Ragnok said. "I believe a conviction is very probable. But I've been doing this for 41 years and I've learned not to say if before the verdict. When Crouch is convicted," Harry said, "what happens to the Foundation's assets?" "The frozen accounts. They revert to the families from whom they were taken. Assessed individually, distributed according to the original ownership documentation, with compound interest calculated at the legal rate." He paused. "The Potter share, based on the current audit valuations, is approximately 6.4 million galleons including the interest accrued during the freeze period." Harry absorbed this. 6.4 million. From the original 6.1, grown slightly even while frozen, because money was like that. "Is there a provision," he said, "for using recovered assets before the distribution is formally complete?" Ragnok looked at him with something that was professionally neutral and also, under that, curious. "Under what circumstances?" "I want to hire a healer. A specialist in Dementor exposure effects. Full-time for at least a year, probably 2. He paused. "And I want to buy the house next to Linnet Hall, the one to the east, the Pemberton property. It's been on the market for 3 months. It would give Sirius his own space while being close enough that," he stopped. "I want him to have somewhere that's his. Not mine. His. And I want someone qualified to help him with what 12 years did." The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the magical hearth made its small sounds. Ragnok sat very still for a moment, which was not a thing Ragnok usually did. He was a man in motion, always, pen to paper, thought to action, decision to document. The stillness was noticeable. "The Pemberton property," he said finally, "is worth approximately 4,000 galleons. A full-time specialist healer of the appropriate qualification would cost roughly 800 galleons per year. Both are within the discretionary spending provisions for the primary vault, which has been untouched and is currently, I know what's in the primary vault, Harry said. Yes, Ragnok said. You do. He picked up his quill. I'll have the Pemberton purchase filed by Monday. The healer search will take a few weeks. I want to do it properly and vet the candidates. Dementor specialist work is a small field and not all of them are good, Harry said. Do it properly. Ragnok looked at him. You're 6 years old, he said. Not critically. More like a man who keeps noting this fact and finding it persistently insufficient to explain what he's observing. Yes, Harry said. I'm aware. Your parents, Ragnok said, would have. He stopped himself. Put the quill down. Picked it up again. I have said several times that your parents would have been impressed by you. I am going to stop saying it because it implies you're operating relative to their expectations, which you're not. You're operating relative to your own. He looked at the kitchen window, briefly. That is better. Harry looked at him for a moment. Thank you, he said, for what he thought was probably the 4th or 5th time, in each case meaning something different. This one meant, for saying that, specifically. Don't thank me, Ragnok said, reflex, and then, you're welcome. The full Wisengamot session, the one the audit findings had been building toward, the one that would formally adjudicate the Foundation theft and the distribution of recovered assets and the legal findings against the named principals, was scheduled for the last week of April. Sirius Black was 3 weeks out of Azkaban. He came to Linnet Hall 10 days after his release, the day after the healer that Ragnok had vetted had been engaged. He arrived in the late morning, on foot from the apparition point at the village, and Harry was in the oak tree when he saw him coming up the drive. He climbed down. Sirius was, better than the courtroom, which had been the minimum, and different from the letters, which had been the version of himself he could construct in writing. He was in muggle clothes that fit badly and he was thin in a way that wasn't going to fix itself quickly but was working on it, and his grey eyes in daylight were clearer than they'd been in the hearing chamber. He was looking at the house with the expression of someone who has heard a place described enough times that arriving at it feels familiar and strange simultaneously. He looked at Harry. Harry looked at him. You're short, Sirius said. You're tall, Harry said. Yeah, I lost some weight, it makes everything look taller. He paused, looking at the house. This is really yours. Ours, Harry said. If you want. He pointed east. The Pemberton property is next door. It's yours. We're buying it. You can do what you want with it. Sirius looked at him. You didn't have to, I know, Harry said. You can argue with me about it later if you want. The oak tree is this way. He led Sirius around the side of the house to the east lawn, and they stood under the oak tree in the early spring light, and Sirius looked up at it the way you look at something you've been imagining for months. 6 feet to the first branch, Harry said. Then another 4 to the good one. It's a straight shot once you're up. Sirius put his hand on the bark. His hand was large, and thin at the wrist in the way of someone whose muscles had wasted and were rebuilding, and he kept it there for a long moment. James climbed this, he said. Apparently. When he was in trouble. He was in trouble a lot. I've heard, Harry said. The portrait inside told me. He says James broke 2 window panes with a quaffle from this exact spot. Sirius looked at the house. At the south-facing windows that still bore the marks of replaced panes if you knew what you were looking for. His jaw did the tight thing, briefly. The portrait, he said. Which portrait? The one in the upstairs hallway. He's got Charles Potter's face but he says he's from the generation before. That's Ignatius, Sirius said. He lectured James every time he came over. James used to say good morning to him in the most deliberately annoying voice possible just to watch him go red. He paused. He told you about the window panes. He's been telling me things for months, Harry said. He's very talkative for a portrait. I think he was lonely. Sirius looked at Harry. At the house. At the oak tree. At the east lawn with its early spring green coming through the restoration. I was supposed to be here, he said. It came out quiet. Not self-pitying, just stating the shape of a thing. This is where you were supposed to grow up. With me. Somewhere like this. I know, Harry said. I'm sorry I wasn't, you couldn't help that, Harry said. Crouch put you in Azkaban. You didn't choose that. I chose to switch to Peter. You were trying to protect them. You got it wrong. That's different from choosing. Harry looked at him steadily. I've read everything in the file. I know what happened. You made a bad call and Crouch used it and Dumbledore didn't look, and here we are. He paused. Here we are, though. That's what matters. Here. Sirius was quiet for a moment. The wind came through the oak tree and made its spring sound, the new leaves not fully out yet but the buds there, the potential of it. You're 6, Sirius said. Not the way Ragnok said it, different register. More like something surfacing. Yes. You write like you're 40. I've been reading a lot. Yeah. Sirius looked at the first branch. I used to be a good climber. So climb, Harry said. Sirius looked at the branch. At his hands. Back at the branch. Then he jumped for it. Got it, barely, the upper body strength not fully there yet, but enough. He hung for a moment, arms shaking slightly with the effort, and then he pulled himself up with the specific obstinate quality of someone who has decided a thing is happening and is making it happen through willpower more than strength. He got to the first branch. Sat there, breathing harder than a healthy person should from one pull-up. The next one, Harry said from below. 4 more feet. Give me a second, Sirius said, and there was something in his voice, ragged, real, slightly laughing at himself, that was exactly the voice from the letters. Just louder. Just actually present. He got to the second branch. Harry climbed up after him and they sat in the oak tree in the early spring cold, the east lawn spread below them, Linnet Hall solid and old at their backs. You can see the Pemberton property from here, Harry said. The red roof. Sirius looked east. Found the red roof. Looked at it for a while. Tell me about the trial, he said. The one coming up. Full Wizengamot session, Harry said. Augusta's been building the votes for 6 months. Ragnok has the audit presentation ready. Griphook has the legal arguments on the foundation principles. Crouch will be there, he's been charged but the criminal trial is waiting on the Wizengamot findings. What happens to him? Prison, Harry said. Not Azkaban, his barrister has already been making arguments about his age. Probably house arrest and disgrace, which is a different kind of bad. Not Azkaban, Sirius said. Flat. Looking at the Pemberton property. No. Good, Sirius said. Nobody should, he stopped. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Not even him. Harry looked at him. At the profile, the too thin jaw, the gray eyes that had things in them that were going to take time to work through. I know, Harry said. They sat in the tree for a long time. The cold didn't bother Harry, who'd sat in this tree on colder mornings. Sirius seemed to be doing the opposite of minding the cold, leaning into it slightly, like someone who has been in a place with no weather for 12 years and finds even cold weather extraordinary in its sensory honesty. I have about 40 questions about your letters, Sirius said eventually. The reading. The inheritance. He looked at Harry. You said you broke the ward. A 5-year-old breaking a Dumbledore masterwork blood ward. I was very hungry, Harry said. Sirius stared at him. And angry, Harry said. Mostly hungry. Just hungry. And alone in a cupboard. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. I'm going to need a full account of the Dursley household, he said. I'm told Ragnok has files. He has files on everything. Good. Sirius's jaw tightened again, briefly. I'm going to read all of them. I know, Harry said. The files on the Foundation principles are more interesting. I'll read those too. He looked at the house. Then I'm going to plant something in that garden. Do you know if there's anything left of your grandmother's rose beds? East side of the south garden, Harry said. The restoration team worked around them. They're coming back. Good, Sirius said. She loved those. It was so ordinary. That was the thing about it. They were sitting in a tree talking about rose beds, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world except for the 12 years and the courtroom and the chains that hadn't activated and the 6 months of letters and the 500 years of house that was finally being a house again. Harry looked at the east lawn, at the garden, at the Pemberton property's red roof, at Lynette Hall behind him. The Wisengamot session is Thursday, he said. Do you want to come? Sirius was quiet for a moment. Will they stare at me? Yes. Will it matter? Not to the outcome, Harry said. But it might matter to them. Seeing you. What they actually did when they voted to lock you away. Sirius looked at the sky through the oak canopy. At the blue between the branches, which was very blue and very ordinary and apparently, if you hadn't seen it in 12 years, something close to extraordinary. Yeah, he said. I'll come. The night before the session, Ragnok came to Lynette Hall with the final pre-session documents, the updated asset distribution calculations, the full list of formal charges against the Foundation principals, the procedural order for the session. He spread them on the kitchen table. Harry and Sirius sat on one side. Ragnok sat across from them. Varka put tea on, which nobody specifically asked for and everyone specifically needed. Ragnok looked at Sirius for a moment, the professional assessment, the 41-year version, and then said, Mr. Black. I'm glad the hearing went as it did. That's pretty good, Sirius said, with something that was almost certainly intended to be dry humor but was too honest to be fully dry. Thank you. For all of it. The audit, the motions. Harry tells me you did most of the heavy lifting. Harry directed the work, Ragnok said. We provided the tools. Sirius glanced at Harry. Sure. He did, Ragnok said, matter of fact. The session motion was his decision. The timing was his decision. Your hearing was his decision to prioritize. The Pemberton property, he paused. That was also his decision. Sirius looked at Harry again, differently this time. Harry looked at the documents on the table and said, What time does the session start? 9, Ragnok said. We should arrive by 8:30. The Foundation principals, all of them will be present. Crouch and 4 others. The remaining 2 have reached cooperation agreements with the DMLE. Carmichael testified 6 months ago. Vane's written account is on record. Crouch's barrister, Harry said. I read the filings. He's going to argue prosecutorial overreach. That the Gringotts Audit Authority doesn't extend to criminal proceedings. He is. Griphook has the counterargument prepared. The Wisengamot precedent from 1812, Harry said. Gringotts versus the Ministry of Magic over the Flamel account seizure. The court found that Gringotts Family Charter Authority took precedence over Ministry Administrative Authority in all cases involving a minor heir. Ragnok looked at him. I read it last week, Harry said. It's in the library. Volume 43 of Precedents and Principles, 3rd shelf from the left in the east alcove. He paused. It's very clear. Crouch's barrister knows it's there. He's going to argue that the 1812 precedent doesn't apply because the Flamel case involved active fraud against the bank itself rather than against a client. Which is wrong, the judgment language is broader than that, but it's a reasonable argument for buying time. Ragnok picked up his quill. Made a note. I'll have Griphook address the 1812 language specifically in the opening statement. You already knew about this, Harry said. I was curious whether you did, Ragnok said. Sirius was looking between them with an expression that was equal parts incredulous and something warmer. They went through the documents. Harry asked questions and Ragnok answered them, and Sirius contributed at one point a very specific piece of information about Crouch's political history from the period when Sirius had been an Auror, which turned out to be relevant to the procedural overreach argument, and which Ragnok wrote down with the focus of someone who knows when they're receiving useful information. By midnight the documents were done. Ragnok packed them and left. Varka had gone to bed an hour ago. Sirius sat back in his chair with the look of someone who has done more sustained thinking in one evening than they've had the capacity to do in years and is feeling both exhausted and somehow better for it. He's something, Sirius said, after Ragnok's footsteps had faded down the front path. Yes, Harry said. Both of you are something. He paused. You ran a Wisengamot campaign at 5 years old. Ragnok and Augusta ran it, Harry said. I made decisions. From what I can tell, you made all the important ones. Harry looked at the cleared table, the rings from the tea mugs, the lamp burning low. You would have gotten out eventually, he said. The ward would have been replaced. Someone would have looked at the accounts eventually. Dumbledore would have, I don't know. Something would have happened. Maybe, Sirius said. The ward breaking just made it happen now instead of in 6 years, Harry said. I was hungry and tired and it came out. I didn't plan it. You didn't plan it, Sirius said. But everything after it, that was you. Harry was quiet for a moment. Outside, Linnet Hall was settling into its nighttime sounds, Old Stone doing what Old Stone does in the dark. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow's going to be long. Yeah. Sirius pushed his chair back. Stood, with slightly more steadiness than he'd had 10 days ago. Looked at Harry in the lamplight. You know, he said, James used to do that. The face you're making. The one where you've decided the conversation is over because there's a practical thing to focus on instead. Harry looked at him. Just saying, Sirius said. You're very much his. He went upstairs. Harry heard his footsteps cross the landing, heard the door of the guest room close. He sat in the kitchen for another few minutes. The lamp. The table. The house around him. You're very much his. He turned the lamp down and went to bed.